لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله. لا إله إلا الله.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا بفيض فضلك رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah. Today we're looking at a critically important topic, which is why marriage contracts and agreements matter and what you should know before getting married. And this is our critical issue seminar for this month. Now, people have some very interesting conceptions of marriage. And if you ask people, what is marriage? They'll give you some very interesting answers. And we'll ask you, those of you who are here or online, that what is a marriage? What's a marriage? Yeah, so it's a union of two people, okay? Over here. What's a marriage? Okay, it's a union of two people. Okay. It's a family. Okay. And these are true. What's a marriage? It's a sunnah, but so is siwak. Okay, it's a contract. Okay. It's a contract between two people, right? So at the heart of it, people have very interesting conceptions of marriage. And if we see online, for example, someone saying marriage is coming together of two hearts. And that's similar to the idea of a union. And that's true. Although not necessarily, marriage could be very transactional. Some of the scholars said that, the verse, which I call ayatul shadi, the verse of marriage, that وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً, and He has placed between you love and mercy. They said there's two types of marriages. If you married someone you wanted to marry, then Allah has placed between you love. But if you just married out of circumstance or practicality, or perhaps due to a lack of options, then at least have mercy between you, right? So sometimes marriage can be very practical. In some societies, people would marry out of duty. That if the older daughters of the older brother passed away, then sometimes in some tribal societies there would be an expectation that the next brother would marry that woman in order for the children to be taken care of, etc. As a matter of honor, whether the person liked the woman or not. Right? And there could be other circumstances why someone could marry. There's one sister who was an artist, and she said, the reason I married my husband was for a very practical reason. She wanted to be able to dedicate herself to her artistic career. So she married someone who could support that career, right? And by the way, there's all kinds of people here, and nothing I'm saying is intended to be referring to anyone. Even some of the people online, I know you, I'm not talking about you, right? So if any of this, these are practical, common life circumstances. So I'm not hinting at or implying anything to anybody, right? Bismillah. So in this topic, right, one of the very strange things that happens is that people approach marriage in a very fuzzy manner. So what happens is they look at what the marriage is. The marriage is a celebration. Well, not technically, right? Now that may be part of what you will do at the marriage, right? But some people put the focus on the marriage ceremony itself and the related celebrations. Everybody else got to do all these cool, fancy things, so they want to do cooler and fancier things. So some people are focused on the marriage celebration itself. Other people, and it doesn't make sense, but this is how actually love works. Maulana Rumi says, some people don't love the beloved. They love love. Right? They love the idea of being in love. Right? But what does love mean? What does it require? They have no idea. Right? So people also, and this relates to some people's notions of what they seek in the person they marry. And they have these rom-com notions of marriage and of getting married as well. So they stumble. There's a answer online that it's a union of two parties coming together under the shade, under the Sharia, the guidance of Allah Most High, to reach the best potential of ultimately reaching the good pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through it. So some people get married and say, well, I'm getting married to have children. And some people, particularly, let's say, I had a friend from one of the Balkan countries, and he was very much single and not trying to get married. But he used to keep coming to me and saying, Shaykh Faraz, could you make dua that Allah grant me righteous children? I said, normally that requires certain things before. He said, yeah, but I heard in one of the classes that you judge a tree by its fruits. I said, well, first there needs to be a tree before there can be fruits. So some people are just looking for certain outcomes, whether it be children. Some people want to get started with their family life. Some people have all kinds of expectations through marriage. But marriage, Islamically, at the heart of it, is a very practical and simple matter. The marriage is a contract. It's a contract between two parties. So we're going to look first at why marriage contracts and agreements matter. Then, second session, we're going to look at the elements of meaningful marriage contracts and some of the key elements, mahar, the right of divorce, and some of the elements of excellence in this. And this is something that is deeply shocking. And alhamdulillah, some of you have come here to learn about this, but frequently people they go to the nikah not even having prepared their marriage contract. I have a copy of my sample marriage contract in my email box too. Now with iCloud and stuff, I have it there as well, because it often happens that some scholar shows up at a nikah last minute and there's no marriage contract. So it's like, you don't have a marriage contract? So they reach out to their friends. So I send them my sample marriage contract. And then problems arise because there are elements of contracts that are important to take care of, right? So one of the areas that one should be putting most attention to when one enters the marriage is the required element, which is the marriage contract, but also, as we will contend, the marriage agreement itself. And then, the marriage agreement is very, very important because we are not in an age of shared expectations. Right? There were certain societal defaults in different societies. So, for example, pretty much all my Arab friends, if I wanted to ask them, when did you get married? I just ask, how old is your oldest son, daughter? And they told me the age. I knew they got married 9 months and a bit before that. And typically it was 9 months and a few days, a few weeks. It was just a default. You get married, you have kids right away. But many of these expectations aren't clear. What does the wife do after marriage? Those expectations aren't clear due to choice, but also due to societal circumstances. So this is one of the important aspects. And there are a few key outcomes that we want to highlight, which summarize themselves as follows. The first is that we wanted to highlight the importance of understanding marriage contracts and agreements. Secondly, to have clarity regarding the wisdom of there being a conditional right of divorce for women. So the sisters seem very much awake right now, but if you're going to go to sleep, do not get married without specifying the conditional right of divorce, because divorce counts. But divorce by default is in the hands of men. Right? In that, if a man pronounces divorce, it counts. And we'll look at why, but also there's a test in it. Life is meant to be a test. And if you're in the exam room, you can't raise your hand and say, excuse me, I have an objection. This test is not enjoyable. Have you been able to do that in any exam so far? No, right? Because it's not meant to be enjoyable. Right? This life is a test. And different elements of it are there to be testing. And one of those testing elements is the test of divorce in marriage. Because most divorce sadly does not happen in a thought out way. And we'll look at that. But how sadly abuse does take place in marriage, dispute that takes place in marriage. How does a wronged woman get out of marriage? Particularly if the man does not agree to give her the divorce. Particularly if the man does not agree to give her divorce. And that is where being able to specify the conditional right of divorce or the unconditional right of divorce. Of course, what that means is that the woman could simply divorce herself from her husband, if it's unconditional, without it requiring any other steps, or if it's conditional, if that condition was met. And we'll see some of the common cases. Then nothing else is required. She does not need to go to a council of scholars or any other process. So it has benefits, it also has challenges, as we will see. And then the final component that is of significance is to appreciate what is of benefit to include in marriage agreements and the merits of agreeing to those things in advance. And the last thing, to appreciate the wisdom, the mercy, and the just balance, the adl, and the just balance of divine guidance and prophetic teachings. So the very first thing is why marriage contracts and agreements matter. And this comes from the basic realization that what is a marriage? And what is a marriage? And we looked at a few of these general notions. As a matter of being, as we're supposed to be, rational beings. Right? And this is one of the great challenges of modernity, that even though materialist society defines you as an economic being. You are a material economic being, but you would assume that then an economic being, that one who's just concerned about material benefit, would make rational economic choices. However, the nature of society is that it is not there for you to make rational choices, but for you to make choices that are advantageous for others. Right? So society, marketing, advertising, media, even the way we make our consumer choices and other life choices are based on being emotional beings rather than rational beings. Right? And that permeates a lot of our thinking. Yeah? That seems really good. That's wonderful. That's this, that's that. And that even permeates our language. For example, how much exaggeration we use in our language. And some of it, nobody's saying to be BRPs, right? Boring, rational people. One can have joy, but to be rational, to make choices that are for our good. Right? And that's something that religion takes very seriously. Why? Because religion has come to address the intellect. And it calls those of intellect to make considered choices that are for the good, for themselves and others, in this life and the next, towards the ultimate good. That's how we should be. However, part of even the way we are educated is that we do not train our rational faculty. We are trained to be economic animals, but economic animals that are part of a system where we are cogs in a system rather than considering what our own material, what our own true benefit is. So the way we look at things is colored by this. And one of the basic cogs of sound thinking is that we should think about things by what they are. There are 4 fundamental questions that anything you should be thinking about, which are what, why, how, and then whether and when. What is it? And the best way of thinking of something is to understand the reality of something. And you can define things, the scholars of logic tell us, either by its essence or reality, or you can define something descriptively. Right? But training ourselves to think clearly is one of the ways we honor ourselves, or we embrace the divine honor of the human being rather than being merely emotional animals. Because then we are like puppets in someone else's show, right? Which is not what you were created to be. So what is marriage? We looked at a number of definitions. It's a union. It is a coming together of 2 people. These things, that's all true. However, at the heart of it, as we've emphasized, marriage is a contract, right? Marriage is a contract. Marriage, at the heart of it, is, simply put, a contract between 2 people. It is a contract between 2 people. It has defaults, but all the elements of it, beyond that, are not required, as we'll see, many things. And yes, there are societal norms and expectations, and society and civilization have benefit. You could have come here, you could have wrapped yourself in your shower curtain. And as long as you were dressed, it would be fine. And don't judge the person next to you, right, about what they're dressed in. But you could have put on anything and come, right? You're covered, but there's merit to societal norms. But at the same time, are we slaves to societal norms? No. And there are many circumstances where we have to have clarity. What is the reality of something? What are sunnah elements of it? And then what are other matters that are from our choices or that are societal suggestions? But we are not bound by those necessarily. For example, what if Jack and Jill went up the hill and they fell in love? And it was a beautiful, innocent love, something that reminds us of Majnoon and Layla. But Jack lives in Mumbai and Jill lives in Jakarta, and they can't be together for the next 6 years. So they got married. Do you have to move in together if you get married? No, you don't. Jack's not earning, but does he have to provide for his wife if they're not living together? No, he doesn't. Okay, so having clarity of what is at the heart of the contract, what are defaults, and then what are choices. And there are many different things, many different arrangements that can arise out of that. What about a couple? What about, let's say, much later in life? Jack and Jill, when they're young, went up the hill. They fell in love, but they never got married. Jack married someone in Jakarta. Jill married someone in Mumbai. But then their spouses both died. And at the hospital, they ran into each other 40 years later, now age 56 and 58. Jill's already a grandmother. Jack has lots of kids living with him. So they can't be together, but they want a life companion. Do you have to live together if you're married? No. There are possibilities of all kinds. And we see examples of those throughout history, right? Particularly if done in good ways. So it's important to appreciate this reality of marriage as a contract. Now, forget marriage for a second. What are elements of a good contract? What are elements of a good contract? So I'll ask you a couple of questions. Please do respond. The first of these is that what is the purpose of a contract? Let's say you got somebody to do some work for you. Okay. You decided to paint your room fuchsia, whatever fuchsia is, but it's some dramatic color. So what would you want in the contract? Why would you want to put it in a contract? Okay, to have a default, but what do you want to do with the contract itself? Yeah, to have terms that are agreed upon. Why do you want to agree on the terms? In case something goes wrong. Right? In case something goes wrong. So that you don't have dispute. Right? So you don't have dispute. That afterwards said, it was a lot of work. So I want $50 extra. No, we agreed on $250 and you did exactly what was in the contract, so that avoids dispute. So contracts are very powerful, right, in that they have three key roles. The fulfillment of rights and responsibilities, the preservation of each party's rights, and the prevention of wrong, right? And also the prevention of dispute. But a good contract would have certain characteristics, right? One, it would have clarity of terms, right? It would have clarity of the terms that are significant. Right? Now imagine you get the painter and the contract says, while you are painting, you will make dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And during painting, you will smile. And I promise to provide you with water and snacks that are low in sodium. But you didn't agree on the price, right? So you can have all these decorative elements that are beautiful, but a contract's not meant to be beautiful, right? It's nice if it's beautiful, but the core of it is you have clearly defined essential terms. Secondly, it's structured to facilitate fulfillment. It's structured to facilitate fulfillment, and to preserve rights and responsibilities, and to try to reduce disputes. One of the great scholars of Islam, Raghib al-Isfahani, and he should be more known than he is, certainly in the English language, although there's a wonderful book on the ethics of Raghib al-Isfahani by a wonderful Kiptonian scholar, Professor Yasin Muhammad. And the PDF is floating online, actually legally, because he himself put it up on academia.org for those interested. But Raghib al-Isfahani says that contracts are not needed in the presence of love, but nothing restores love when it is challenged like agreement. That you had agreed to something. So when love is tested, it can be a distant thing that, well, I love you. No, right now, you're mad at each other about something or the other. Who owns the hut on top of the hill that Jack and Jill went up to? Jack says, I paid for it. Jill says, I built it. But if they'd clearly defined terms, that facilitates the restoring of that love, that connection between the two. So these are some elements of a good contract. Now, how does that apply then to marriage itself? Right? And marriage is, particularly if properly spelled, marriage is a critical contract. Right? Marriage is a critical contract. Why is marriage possibly the most important of contracts? Yeah, it's a long matter. Right? Marriage, your room got, instead of fuchsia, they painted your room pink. Correcting it is not such a big deal. You just repaint it. But you get stuck in a marriage. Jack fell madly in love. He agreed to $250,000 mahar. It's binding. Jill says, Jack, funny is funny, but money is money. And love alone won't pay my bills. So she wants $250,000. Right? There's a lot more implications. Right? There's a lot more implications. If a cell phone plan is bad, how long does it take to change a cell phone plan? How long does it take to change a cell phone plan? A few hours on the phone, or if you can be dramatic, within an hour, you can change a cell phone plan. I have a friend who's twice helped me change cell phone plans because he's much better at being dramatic than I am. But marriage is a particularly important matter because it has lifelong implications, it has deep financial implications, it affects our choices, and for that there's an important principle that we need to appreciate, that in general, any matter can be judged by three things. The first is the intention behind it, because even the best of actions could be ruined by an ill intent. So Jack and Jill went up the hill, and Jill fell in love. Jack didn't love Jill, but he knows she's the daughter of Uncle Bill. Uncle Bill's the one who kicked him out from the board of the masjid and then had him banned from the masjid, etc. But now he no longer remembers. Jack and Jill were in their 30s in this version of their life story. So Jack only married Jill, so he went through all the motions, but what did he do? He married her just to divorce her. He married her just to divorce her. He entered the marriage correctly. Ijab, Qabul, witnesses, the whole thing. Jack's wealthy, a few $1,000s on the marriage, or tens of thousands of dollars. It's nothing. But he just intended harm. Right? So one aspect that matters judged by is the intention itself. Secondly, the matter at hand, the intention governing. Why are you doing it? Second, how you go about the action itself. Now, marriage refers to two things. Marriage is the contract itself, but the state thereafter of being married. Right? Of being married. So how do you plan on being married? Right? And thirdly, the consequences if the aims of the matter are fulfilled, or the harms if it isn't. So in that regards, marriage is particularly significant. Why? Because our beloved Prophet ﷺ tells us, with respect to the intention governing marriage, that nikah is from my sunnah. Nikah is from my sunnah, it's from my example. But how many people get married and it's okay, why are you getting married? If you could freeze frame the moment before the officiator starts the marriage. You ask, why are you getting married? What's the intention behind it? And it's rare that someone says, oh, I'm getting married to seek the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, etc. But marriage, the Prophet ﷺ referred to, is from my sunnah. There's lots of things from his sunnah, but this is a key element. This part of the civilizational sunnahs, that it's a building block of a religious, not just family, but community, society, and ummah. This is a key building block. But the Prophet ﷺ also said that whoever gets married has completed half their religion. And marriage is a very significant step. We won't go into, but approaching it wrong has implications on your religious well-being. Secondly, the marriage itself lasts a long time and a lot can go wrong. There's a lot of potential for abuse, for you to be harmed in your deen and in your dunya. There's also a lot of potential in you being harmed emotionally. Right? Which is why there's a good case not to get married. Right? And it's actually a very rational decision that with confused notions of marriage, why a lot of people don't get married. Because there are a lot of downsides to marriage. And the scholars identified the downsides of marriage at length. Those downsides aren't there in order for you not to get married, but in order for you to enter marriage with circumspection. That you know what are the potential harms of marriage. One of the greatest harms of marriage is you can if you're a person of religious concern, for you to become a diminished being called a worldling. It's a bit without any of the merits of halflings, because they ended up being of very noble in Middle Earth, but we don't live in Middle Earth. A worldling is a diminished human being. Diminished not in physical size, but in rank, ultimately. That you weren't created just to eat, drink, procreate, and die. And it's very easy to get lost in that. But how you approach the marriage itself can be affected by the contract. And then the consequences of the non-fulfillment of terms are great. Right? So this is why having a contract is very, very critical. So that the key elements that build the marriage can be clearly in place. But also for both parties, not just to go through the motions. Human beings are very good at forms rather than meanings. Right? So a lot of people, for example, they get a moment of religious concern. So what do? Let's say someone's kind of wealthy. So in a moment of religious concern, they say, I'll build a masjid. But they might still not pray themselves. Okay? So it happened, one of the very notable scholars, as part of the Seekers faculty in Istanbul, Shaykh Faraz Rabbani, mentioned about his father, one of the distinguished scholars of Damascus, who mentioned that right by the University of Damascus, there was this plot of land that opened up. And they wanted to buy it to establish a masjid. Because due to all the post-colonial influence, And there was a militant secularism governing a lot of Muslim countries, amongst them Syria. And we still see the effects of that. So there was no place to pray by the University of Damascus. And you couldn't pray inside the university either. So they wanted to build this place up. But someone had to buy it. So this lady came to the Shaykh, and these were tough times in the Muslim world, right? Probably in the 50s, thereabouts. Very tough times. This lady came, not dressed in hijab, and said, Shaykh, I want to buy this property to establish this mosque. And I said, to pay for it fully. So Shaykh Muhammad Awad said, Bismillah. Said, but could you come to our house? Just imagine, in very conservative Syrian society, to invite a woman who's not wearing hijab to your house. And so she went and sat on the lady side of the living room. And he thanked her and told her of the great rewards of building a mosque for the sake of Allah. But he said, something that would even be more beloved to me than you doing this. He said, what? He said, if you put on the hijab. You start wearing hijab. He said, why? He said, because on the day of judgment, if you didn't build the masjid, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wouldn't ask you about it. But this, my dear sister, Allah would ask you about. So you begin with what Allah would ask you about. But very often, we pay attention to these forms. Right? That we want to get the most amazing qari. But will you pray on your wedding night? Right? Like, which is more important? You don't even have to have Quran recitation at your wedding. It's good. Sunnah on important occasions that we said, okay, we need to do all these religious functions. We want a munshid there, this and that, with other things. But what about just avoiding the impermissible elements? So this is how we approach the heart of the contract. Now, something important that while marriage contracts are important, there's a fundamental difference between a marriage contract and an agreement. So to understand what's a contract, let's just say that if I have a few nephews, right? My kids are all gallivanting on vacation. Let's say I needed some help moving stuff from my basement. So my nephews, I asked them that, could you come Sunday morning to help me move some stuff? They said yes. Is that a contract? Is that a contract? No, it's not. It's a promise. It's a promise. Right? Because a contract is when there's consideration involved from both parties and there are consequences to its non-fulfillment. Right? There's considerations from both parties. And there are consequences to their non-fulfillment. So a lot of things aren't contracts and they cannot be enforced in a contract. So for example, if you hire somebody to paint your room, if you put a condition that you will be smiling at me while you're painting, is that an enforceable condition? No, it's just a promise. Because this has no relationship to the work itself. Okay? It's considered a frivolous stipulation. It's not enforceable. So, in a marriage contract, the marriage itself has very little that is essential to the marriage itself. And we look at the elements. All things that happen after the marriage that are not core to the marriage are simply promises. They are promises between the two parties. You will cook for me. It's a promise. You will be kind to me. Let's say Jack hates Uncle Bill. Say, you will visit my family and be nice to them. But Jack and Uncle Bill, Jill's father, continue fighting. So, does he have to be nice to Uncle Bill? No. Right? Those aren't enforceable. And you see something being a promise rather than a contractual agreement in that, what if it's not fulfilled? Is this something enforceable? Could it be demanded? Right? So, at the heart of the marriage, especially because with the length of marriage and the time that marriages take, very often people's life circumstances change. Okay? So a contractual condition would be something that if it's not fulfilled, either the marriage did not happen. If Jack and Jill got married up the hill without witnesses, right? The birds and the angels don't count as witnesses, right? So that wasn't a marriage. If you didn't pay the mahar and it's due, that is enforceable. You can demand it, and in a Muslim country, you could take them to court for it because it has implications. It has implications. On the other hand, a promise is something that you hold yourself to, but if you don't, while you might be sinful, it does not affect the contract itself. Right? So imagine, for example, Jack and Jill agree that we'll have children within the first year of marriage. But turns out that one of them can't have kids. Is that something enforceable in the marriage contract? No. So those are agreements rather than conditions. Those are agreements rather than conditions because they're not enforceable in of themselves. They're not enforceable in of themselves. So within a marriage contract itself, there are relatively few things, but they're critical elements that you do and must include. So in the first part, we wanted to highlight that having a marriage contract is important because this is Islamically what the fundamental marriage is. And this is something that many of you, when you're looking to get married, should think about because a lot of the stuff that people consider essential to marriage isn't. Very often, people, like if scholars came to town, families would try to get, their daughters married to this scholar. Communities would want the scholar to either stay in their community or remain connected with their community through marriage. But the sheikh's going to be living in Damascus. He's only going to be in that small town a few times a year. Now, do husband and wife have to live together? No, that's not part of the marriage. But it could be agreed upon. Because when Jack and Jill went up the hill and they agreed to get married, Jill said, look, I will marry you, but on condition that you must live in our hometown. That's not part of the marriage contract itself. But that's something that could be stipulated in the agreement, where they live, for example. So what are the elements that can be included in the marriage contract itself? Right? The elements of meaningful marriage contracts. There are certain simple elements of a marriage contract. It should say contract. The first is very straightforward, that there is an ijab, there's an offer, and number two, there is an acceptance. And these can be from either party. That's all the marriage is. So if you're experienced in conducting marriages, technically, how long does a marriage contract take? Yeah, literally you can do it in seconds. So let's say I'm acting on behalf of Jack and Ustad Shariq is acting on behalf of Jill. Right? So I say, Zawajtuka Jill bin Bill. And he says, Qabiltu. That's it. It happened. Now, in the Hanafi school, you don't actually have to mention the mahar. The mahar is entailed by the contract. So literally, it could be a 3-second burst. There's witnesses there. Anyone present is a witness. So if Ustad Shariq and I got Jack and Jill married, where were the witnesses? All of you are witnesses because you're all present and there's a marriage taking place. But you know, it's good to slow it down. The ijab and qabul, there's a couple of elements to it. One is that either party can initiate. Either party can initiate. So whether the husband can, the groom can initiate or the bride can initiate. And either party can either act on their own or appoint someone to act on their behalf. So let's say Jack has stage fright. He does. Because when he was a teenager, he fell off the stage during a school production. So he's scared of stages. But Jill insists that the marriage be on stage. So Jack appoints his uncle, Dr. Alwan, to be his wakil. So Dr. Alwan goes on the stage and says, I, Dr. Bilal Alwan, marry my muwakkil, Jack ibn so-and-so, to marry you, Jill bint Bill. It's allowed. The woman can act on her own behalf, certainly in the Hanafi school, or have someone else act on her behalf. Most commonly, who would be acting on the woman's behalf? Her father or guardian. Her father or guardian. And here, there's difference of opinion within the schools of Islamic law. In some schools, a woman cannot conduct her own marriage. It has to be done through a guardian, whether the father or in the order of guardianship, the wali, because the Prophet ﷺ said, "La nikaha illa bi wali." But you can't have it both ways. I had a very awkward situation during COVID that I was asked to conduct a marriage, and it wasn't a private marriage. It took place here, despite limited attendance. There's people from the family there and so on. The woman in question wanted to conduct her own marriage. I gave her the options. Afterwards, the husband decided that this is not valid. He was very upset with me. So I connected him with some scholars, because one doesn't defend oneself. So I connected him with some scholars of his similar background, and he wasn't convinced by them. So my wife, being a wise woman, she said, look, he's not all he wants is to do it in a particular way. Why don't you just redo it? So I thought that, well, someone else can redo it. And I thought, sometimes it's just good to, even if you're not wrong, just to apologize. So I apologized. I got a little piece of the groom's mind, but okay. Sometimes you just have to, take a punch. And we just redid it. But technically you can't do that, because if you act on one position, you cannot annul it by taking another position. Right? So that's not correct. You could. So this is one of the things to think through. If they want, and ultimately this is, so can a woman act on her own? Can she initiate the ijab or do the qabul? That is something to think about. Often it is done that the woman would agree before the marriage to deputize her father to act on her behalf. And it's wise to put that in writing, etc., to make sure that she's agreeing of it, etc. This generally in Canada, is not a problem, but sometimes it is, sadly. that there are bad habits in our community, particularly in some countries, where it is the family who decides who the daughter will marry, and the daughter simply has to say yes. And there we have to know that both a woman and a man have moral agency. And nobody, unless you were coerced, but coercion is only when there's credible threat of life or limb. Anything short of that, you have moral agency. Right? Granted to you by Allah, confirmed to you by your Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You're not a slave to your family, you're not a slave to your societal expectation, you're a servant of Allah. Right? You respect your family, you respect your parents, you respect societal norms, but you're not a slave to anyone but Allah. And you are not an unconditional follower of anyone but the Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So that has to be clear. But also, where there's difference of opinion, where within the mainstream of Islam, this is a matter that people should agree on beforehand. How will we conduct the marriage? How will we conduct the marriage? Some sisters want to conduct their own marriage. And that is their right within Islamic law. Now, can someone insist that you do what's better? Can someone insist that you must do what's better? No. Like if someone tells you, brother, your trousers could be half an inch wider. Yes, they could be, but they're not. Right? Like, or whatever else. Right? That's why divine guidance has mercy. It's not you must do or you cannot do. We have obligations, recommendations, things that are permitted, things that are disliked, things that are prohibited. There's a gradation to the rulings of the Sharia. But also there's difference of opinion, and that is mercy. And you cannot force another to follow your opinion. Whether before marriage, Jill says, I will only get married if this happens. Okay, that's your right. Can Jack say, no, we must do it this way because every other way is wrong? No. You're not God who decides what is right and wrong. And where there's difference of opinion, these are things that we think through, but they often lead to dispute. How will we conduct our marriage? There's certain situations where someone may have dealt with a lot of trauma in their family, etc. They don't want to get their father involved. But you encourage them that, okay, well, get them involved, get their permission explicitly. But you can conduct, or there could be other reasons. Right? So that there's leeway in that. So this is one of the things to think through. But the third element is specifying the mahar. Specifying the mahar. And we look at elements related to this, but one of the important aspects is how much of the mahar is due up front. How much of the mahar is due up front. Because a woman does not need to agree to move in with the husband or any of the implications of marriage until the mahar that is due up front is given. Right? So Jack and Jill got married and they went to the honeymoon suite that they're going to on wedding night. But Jill, and I'm not advocating this by any means, but Jill was a student of knowledge. So she said, Jack, where's the mahar? He says, oh, I forgot about it. So, okay, come back tomorrow. And she bolts the door from inside. It's her right. It's her right. May not be the wisest way of starting marriage, but it's her right. Right? But rights should be exercised with wisdom. So specifying the mahar up front is important. Leads to a lot of problems later. You also need witnesses, right? And related to witnesses, the sunnah is that the marriage be done publicly and it be announced so that it be known. In some schools, publicizing the wedding, making it known, at least within family, in one's immediate circle of friends, community, is the requirement, and the witnesses are the sunnah, such as in the Maliki school. But properly, you should do both. There needs to be proper witnesses, but private marriages, so secret marriages, are impermissible. even if they were to fulfill the conditions. Okay. So these elements that we have mentioned, we look at some of the aspects of these one by one. And here, I would invite you, please, that any questions you have relating to these elements, we will, be glad to take your questions. One of the elements that is missing is, do you need an officiator for your marriage? Jack and Jill went up the hill, surrounded by friends and family. Do they have to appoint someone to officiate the marriage? Do they? Do they? No. The officiator is not a requirement. However, it is an important sunnah. It is an important sunnah, and critical things you don't take into your own hands. Can you buy a house without getting it checked out by experts? Can you? Yeah, it's your money. Yeah, and this is your life. But would you buy a house without getting it appraised and checked and so on? Why? In case there's issues with it, right? In case there's issues with it. But it's just a house. Worst case, inshallah, you'll make a lot more money, right? When you start the major franchising of your company, right? Once you take over. So, money comes and goes. But marriage has a lot of consequence. It's easy to do things wrong. So, having an officiator is an important sunnah. We see the Prophet ﷺ officiating the marriages of his companions. We see the companions officiating the marriages of those after them. It ensures that these elements are taken care of, but this is an aspect that is very important, that we shouldn't just have a token officiator, that someone random shows up and the key elements of the marriage they had no role in. That properly, a marriage officiator should be someone you engage with beforehand, so that you ensure that there is a well thought out marriage contract. Ideally, the marriage agreement and the elements of the marriage agreement, someone you've talked through with things, and they make sure the marriage is conducted soundly, properly. But also, one of the important sunnahs, and we're not looking at marriage itself, right? We're focusing on the contracts and agreements, but one of the important sunnahs of the nikah is the khutbah al-nikah, is that there be a khutbah of nikah that is given. And the difference between an embarrassing khutbah given by some randomly chosen person and a meaningful khutbah, not only for the couple, but also for those in attendance. I went to one of our local masajid here because someone from our family was getting married. And I wish I was taking notes, because it's such an amazing khutbah. It's one of the really impressive imams in our community. I was like, that's beautiful. So beautiful, right? And even one of the elders who was sitting on the stage afterwards, he said, Beta, I feel inspired as a husband. Because it was meaningful, right? There's a great wisdom in the khutbah al-nikah. So this is one of the aspects that one should not neglect. One, to ensure that one goes through the process properly. But here at the level of community, and many of you here in attendance, but also who are online, are active in the community, this is where we need to specialize. That what is the duty of religious institutions in our community is to provide religious services. And one of the former presidents of one of the large Muslim organizations saying that religion is not preserved by playing basketball. Right? Religion is preserved through the preservation of the core religious functions. That the measure of a masjid, of course, it should welcome a lot of people and all this, but ultimately, it's a place for prayer, for devotion. Right? The other critical services, how do we conduct our marriages, and how do we deal with the deaths of people. Even if people are disconnected from community, everybody, or much of our community gets married, all of us die. So how is that handled? During COVID, someone passed away at one of the masajid. I skirted out of leading the prayer, but then everyone walked away. No one was there to take the coffin, the body, out of the masjid, except one old uncle. So there's this young guy, I think he was Egyptian. I said, could you help? He said, yes, Sheikh, but I'm wearing shorts. But they're like long shorts you could pray in. I said, that's fine. Then he put on his boots. I said, Sheikh, but I'm wearing colorful boots. Is it okay? I said, go ahead. Because colorful boots, but literally it was just myself, and I have a bad back, and this elderly gentleman. The whole family, though one of the important sunnahs related to death and burial is, actually the proper sunnah is we should be carrying the casket. But if we don't do that, at least follow the body. And these are easy things to set up. Right? Easy things to set up, to do them well. I've often seen disputes arise at nikahs. Because who is coordinating the nikah? Nobody. And of course, practically, especially in our times, with the officiator, you should have one unofficial role, is who is running your marriage? Who is running your marriage? Our family is good, especially the males in our family are good at getting nervous and stressed. So when my brother was getting married, I said, who's in charge of arrangements? He said, me and my fiance. I said, no, because you're sitting on the stage. Who's going to make sure everything happens smoothly? He said, you are. I said, no, but I'm going to be on stage with you guys. And so you have to have someone in charge. So my sister stepped up, and someone from the other side. But you know that, okay, so what if something dramatic happens? Who's ensuring that things are taken care of? The janitor of the masjid shows up and says, please, we are going to be closing in 10 minutes. Please finish. And he's not even started the ceremony. Right? Now, you can't get up from stage, right? And you want to also make it memorable. So having someone who's in charge of proceedings is an obvious thing, but especially when we don't have a lot of family, and if we don't have well-established processes for marriages taking place, it should be clear who's running things, because especially if you're getting married, you should be focused on your spiritual and personal readiness for what's taking place. Okay, so the officiator, but also having someone who is project managing the wedding, is a practical component. The offer and acceptance, one of the important elements of this that are often neglected, that both offer and acceptance should be clear, or must be clear and definite. There's a lot of leeway in this in the Hanafi school particularly, but a lot of things that people say are certainly, the least that can be said, they're not according to Sunnah. And you conduct the marriage in a manner that would be differed upon according to the majority of Islamic scholarship. Now, if we see marriage is a contract, so if I pick on my long-standing friend, let's say I want to sell this to Ustad Shariq. If I say, will you buy this for $50? Sure. Is this a contract? Why? Yeah, because will you is a query. And sure is you affirm the minimum. Is this a show of interest? Right? If you pick up something at a tech store, says, are you interested in that? Yeah, I'm considering buying it. Said, okay, I sell it to you for $100. That's not a sale, because I'm interested is not an offer. Right? So very often, the way the ijab and qabul, the offer and acceptance are made, are questionable at best. For example, if you ascribe it to the future, will you marry me? This is a proposal. It is not an offer. it's not an offer. Or if you say, for example, do you agree to marry me? Agreeing to marry is engagement. That I'm now agreeing to marry you, so I'm not going to consider other proposals. Although you need to be careful, because twice it's happened that both times there's actually a lady, a Muslim woman, asked somebody that, I'm thinking, I got engaged to so-and-so, and she talked about how good he was, and her friend went and proposed to the guy, and they got married. So be careful. That's why there's many reasons why discretion is from the Sunnah, right? Especially if we are weak, needy creatures who ultimately self-interest often trumps other things. So it's wrong, especially if the two people were engaged. Pre-engagement, it is even permissible Islamically. It's not wise because it'll lead to broken relationships, but before the two parties have agreed to marry, in the consideration phase, someone else could marry. You can feel hurt, but you can't hold it against them. So these are not these kinds of statements. Will you marry me? Do you agree to marry me? These are not considered properly an ijab and qabul. Now, if someone did get married that way, anything that would ultimately be understood to have been a marriage, particularly people came together for marriage, this is what took place. It is not ideal, but certainly in the Hanafi school, it counts as a marriage. So in front of witnesses, if someone said, I'm your husband, she said, I'm your wife. She said, for life. He said, for life. For the mahar. They did like a spoken word, multi-step ijab and qabul, but it's completely not according to procedure. If everyone's understood, well, at least the witnesses understood that it's a marriage, but it's certainly questionable and certainly not according to the Sunnah. So this component, and this is why having an educated officiator is important. One of the brothers here was mentioning that because he's done wedding photography, that he's attended weddings where the officiator missed the prayer. Get questionable officiators, right? I have an aunt who came by, and she showed up. She went to a nikah, and it was between a same-sex couple, but there's someone imam looking, conducting it. So there are all kinds of people that this is someone who has an important role, and these are the things that they should take care of. But these are things that you should ensure are in place. There's also elements of excellence in the offer and acceptance, that the language should be clear. Right? They should include in it a meaning of turning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Defining one's intention and purpose in it. And also practically, people take all kinds of things seriously, but very often the couple, and they're nervous. They're asked to make the ijab and qabul in Arabic, and they haven't practiced it. The text is not in front of them. So there's elements that, okay, you synchronize the throwing of the petals or all these things, but the marriage itself is that moment of the ijab and qabul. It's a very short thing. It doesn't take much to get that clear. And what each party is going to say, ultimately, you're the one who's saying it. You didn't technically need the officiator, but think it through. How will you express this in a manner? And one of the practical things, put it in writing. Have it. Then you have 2 pieces of paper. This is what the groom will say, and this is what the bride or the person, the father or the wali, this is what they will say. Just have it in writing. Ascertain, so that they're clear. And it can be in any language. It can be in any language. As long as everyone understands that it's a marriage, it does not have to be in Arabic. You can do it in multiple languages. Some people like the sanctity of saying it in Arabic. That's fine, that's good. But practically, in a language that people will understand, I was told by one of my aunts when I conducted my brother's wedding that was not correct. because she thought it had to be said in Urdu. So I said, did the Prophet ﷺ say, "Ye nikah kabool hai"? He says, no, he must have said it in Arabic. I said, exactly. So I didn't argue. I just moved on to greeting other relatives. So, but you didn't say it 3 times. You don't have to say it 3 times either. There's certain legal reasons why in some societies they repeat the nikah in 3 different ways to avoid difference of opinion. But it's not required. It's not required. So that's the offer and acceptance. Practically, it takes a few moments to prepare that in advance. Witnesses. Who can be a witness for you? If you went to court, let's say that some random person named Yusuf got hit by a car. Can he take his father and mother as witnesses to make his case? Islamically, no, he can't. Why? Because there's a conflict of interest. Whose car is it? The parent's car. Who's serving as a witness for you? Your parents. So interested parties cannot be a witness for you. So with witnesses, while it's very noble to have your grandfather and immediate family as witnesses, your grandfather and your brother as witnesses, these don't formally count as witnesses. Right? So that if the nikah was being contested and you went in front of Qadi Aslam Beg, who's officiating over dispute resolution, he cannot admit those witnesses as proof. So a witness has to be, right, has to be someone who is not an interested party, right, who's not an interested party, right, which is, i.e., they cannot be a parent, a sibling, a child, right, ideally not an immediate relative, right, but an uncle is passable. There's a practical way to deal with it, is that do you have to have the minimum number of witnesses? No. Do you have to have the minimum number of witnesses? No, you don't. And sometimes this is a way of honoring family members, elders. You don't have to have just 2 witnesses. You could have more. You could have from both sides of the family. Make them feel honored. Right? So that's one of the ways that you can have more. So you want your grandfather and you have your brothers. Now technically, you don't have to have just one of your brothers. You can include all of them. The more the merrier. They're all there. Have loads of signatures, but you know that at least 2 witnesses are outside the immediate family of both parties. If you want 6 people signing the marriage contract, great. It was a big party and everybody participated. Right? It was a participatory party. So you can have more than the minimum witnesses. Though technically everybody who was there is a witnesses. Practically, the witnesses should be written down in the marriage agreement and the contact details should be put in writing. Now, in many circumstances, and this is particularly important for sisters, sorry for not being sufficiently politically correct, but men particularly often take the policy of deny everything. So people who've been married for 10 years will deny that they were ever married. Say, prove it. What proof can you provide? Right? They didn't have kids. Of course, that's why also the issue of registering the marriage is important. But keep your nikah contract. And now I have most of the nikahs that I've conducted, a few I don't want to have anything to do with, in a folder in my cloud storage. But the number of times, I've only conducted 16 nikahs in 16 years. But where they come and say, Sheikh, do you still have our marriage contract? Because neither husband nor wife nor families have the marriage contract. And then issues arise. Right? So it's important to have that. Especially if you specify things in it. Right? Because there's the marriage itself, but now Jack divorces Jill. Jill says, you owe me $100,000 or you owe me $250,000 in the mahr. That was in the contract. He said, I don't have the contract. Now that is not allowed. You cannot, that's considered to be one of the greatest enormities is qawl al-zur, is a false attestation, false speech, which is to say a lie by which you deny another their rights, or to say a lie by which you take the rights of another. And the Prophet ﷺ referred to the akbar al-kaba'ir, the worst of the major sins, and false speech. He said it and said, "Ala wa qawl az-zur, ala wa qawl az-zur, ala wa qawl az-zur." And he was sitting back, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he leaned forward, and he's saying with so much concern that the Sahaba said, "We wish that he would stop saying it." One, because of how much he was exerting himself and how scared they were, lest one say an untruth by which someone's right was taken. So the witnesses are important because elements of the marriage could be contested. And elements of the marriage agreement could be contested. So no, I never agreed to this, and then they'll say, but it's there in the marriage agreement. So we have two witnesses. Yeah, your father and your brother. Right? So then you can't really do anything about it. Right? And never assume that the other person will be nice. And the human being is defined as a rational animal. When anger or negative emotion takes over, they're no longer rational. So what remains is the animal. And the default is that the angry animal, will scratch and claw. And they'll bark and bite. So beware. That's where law preserves human dignity. Okay, then we have the messy matter of mahr. Mahr. And this causes many problems. Let's say if I sold this power bank to my niece. I said, I sell you this power bank for $100, payable later. Is that allowed Islamically? Is it allowed? It's sinful because in contracts, terms have to be clear and not defining either payments due upfront. If it is deferred, then the period of deferral needs to be known. If you say it's deferred, but to when? Allah knows, well, Allah knows everything, right? But the two people need to know when it's due. So, that is a sinful contract. It's what's called fasid. It's voidable. It's a corrupt contract. So if you did that, if I sold you this power bank for $100, payable later, and you agreed, so that was a contract, but it's a sinful contract. Both of us have the moral duty, the first to repent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because we did something that would lead to dispute. But it's just a power bank. But still it's sinful. And we would have the duty to rectify it. Now we don't get married for the mahr, so having non-definition of how the mahr is paid does not make the marriage sinful, doesn't make the marriage contract voidable. However, it leads to disputes. And we mentioned that the characteristics of good contracts are that they're clear. They avoid dispute. So if Jack and Jill got married for the mahr of $100,000, when would Jill expect the $100,000? Assuming Jill's rational. And thank God, well, there are benefits to human beings not generally being rational. If Jill was behaving as a rational human being, when would she expect the $100,000? No. They got married. Right? So immediately. Because you get the $100,000, you invest it, or you have certain things that you needed, whatever. It's your money. The basis is that you act rationally. Okay, but assuming that nothing was defined, right? So this leads to dispute. As for Jack, he'll say, you know what? But in our culture, in Kurdish culture, it is only payable upon divorce or death. It's one of the most morbid things. I'm not saying Kurdish culture does that, but some cultures that they have this notion that you pay mahar on divorce or death. Well, what's the use of the mahar once you're dead? Right? They'll pay you funeral expenses with your mahar, right? Although, any of you did the economics and paid any attention? Okay. If mahar was made payable upon divorce, if women were behaving rationally, what would happen? More of them would seek divorce, right? Because you could either be with Jack or seek divorce and get $100,000 and to be freed of him, right? So, alhamdulillah, most people don't think that materially, but many do. But it causes other problems as well. It causes other problems. There's one sister, and subhanAllah, it's been 15 years of struggle till she got out of her marriage. She didn't specify the conditional right of divorce, even though some people, myself included, had encouraged her to do so. She got married. Her husband was having affairs. He wouldn't divorce her because if he divorced her, he had to pay $125,000. And her family would not allow her to pursue annulment of the marriage because they said, you need to get that $125,000. So until the guy got his specialization and became a surgeon and all these things, she was stuck in an abusive situation. But then other messy things happen as well. Right? So the mahar, like any other agreed upon matter, should be defined. What is the upfront amount? But also, when is it payable? When is it payable? The right time to pay the upfront mahar is upfront. Either before the marriage takes place, or at the time of the marriage, or upon the nikah taking place. Right? The upfront, a lot of people have this notion of sometime soon. You wouldn't do that if you ran, if someone came and bought some meat. We say, I'll pay you sometime soon. Would you let them take the meat? No. And even like 2 kilos of meat. This is marriage. This is marriage. Now, the mahar is not the core of the marriage, but it is something entailed by the marriage. So the proper practice with the mahar is the upfront amount, either to give it before the marriage takes place or the day off. And it can be done not in a legalistic way, it can be done in a beautiful way. It can be incorporated into the elements of the marriage agreement. Right? But this is one of the aspects. The upfront amount should be defined. Now, if they did not want to have it due upfront, as literally upfront, because I met someone earlier this week. It was quite a traumatic meeting. I had to do a lot of deep breathing after, because I won't share the story. It was crazy. But he spent $250,000 on the nikah. And now a year later, he's trying to get out of it. Okay? And they're demanding $250,000 for for ending the marriage. That's where you should know your rights and responsibilities. Right? The girl's family don't have right to any payment, that taking back our daughter payment. That's not an Islamic thing. Right? Payable to the family, not to her. Right? So that's problematic. So defining the upfront mahar, but secondly, the deferred amount, what's called the muajjal. For the muajjal, the deferred amount, the muajjal, when is it payable? When is it payable? Would you agree for someone to buy a consignment of goods? Say, I'll pay you at a later date. Would you agree to that? But in general, no, at a later date without specifying what the date is. No, you won't. And for you to agree to that would be sinful. It would be sinful. You can't do that in just basic things. But with the mahar, it's important. And you say, well, we're easygoing with the mahar payment. No. Just make it clear. How is it paid? And this leads to countless disputes. Of course, the mahar belongs to the woman, not to her family. The family could take it in order to make sure it's received, but the family has no right to the mahar payment. But when is it payable is a big problem. And don't do strange things, such as death or divorce, for example. At least in some of the Muslim world, there are alleged instances of people, girls' families getting the guy killed in order to get the mahar. But that's a little on the dramatic side, but dramatic things happen in our part of the world. Okay? So for example, if you can actually search for it online, you can hire matrimonial spy agencies who they even hack into the guy's accounts. I've been asked many, many questions about this. In some parts of the world, it's just part of the marriage process. Right? That you can hire agencies who will hack into the guy's account, check his browser history, check his, everything. Of course, completely haram. Completely haram. But alhamdulillah, we're not quite as sophisticated in our marriage processes. So does it have to be mentioned when it's deferred? It's not, the validity of the marriage is not dependent on this, but the simplest, cleanest thing is for it to be mentioned, so it doesn't lead to dispute. It is also a debt, and Islamically, the best thing is not to be in debt. And debts lead to dispute. So clearing debts helps reduce the elements of dispute. Okay? So it doesn't have to be mentioned. One of the practical things, sometimes some families want huge mahars. I have a friend who got married in the late 90s, just a few years after I did, and each of his brothers had paid $100,000 US mahar, cash up front. And my friend was a student of knowledge. He couldn't afford it. Now, one of the things one can do, if the bride and groom agree to it, you could agree to a public mahar. And then you could waive it. I don't know if my wife is here, but we had a very complicated mahar that we set a payment schedule, but then when we went overseas to study, I couldn't afford it. The wife's very practical, so in the end, we settled on the mahar. We didn't have a dispute, but I was thinking about what if we start arguing about mahar? Then I can't afford to pay this complicated monthly payment. So we settled on a fancy food blender. It's a European food blender, a Moulin X. My wife wanted like version, model 350 or something. I said, that's a good deal. So I got the 475 or whatever, the slightly better model, but we took it in writing that no further mahar is due. So you can negotiate, right? One can renegotiate terms, of course, like any other terms, on the basis of mutual agreement. That's the mahar. So do we need witnesses? No. Morally, if you agree to something, you are bound by it. Right? But anything of significance, there are two sunnahs. One is to put it in writing, Number two is to have witnesses. Certain things can be embarrassing, but at least have a clear record of it. Yeah. No, because you can just amend the mahar amount, because the mahar, once in the contract, is a debt. You could renegotiate it. Sometimes it can be embarrassing. So you don't want like the whole world to know. Like, you know, you're on vacation and Jill realizes it's not in her economic interest to receive $250,000 upon divorce, because she's already regretting married Jack, because he elbows her in sleep and a whole bunch of things that are annoying her. And she's very entrepreneurial. So and she has the right of divorce, and she negotiated the unconditional right of divorce. So she doesn't want to like trigger a drastic choice. So he says, okay, look, let's just agree. Why don't you just pay me $75,000 within 6 months? Jack has some extra cash flow right now. So she gets $75,000, then renegotiate. So this falls under the two general sunnahs. In general, anything where there's material significance, one should have it in writing and or have witnesses. In writing, the presence of signatures, for example, is good. Or you could include two trustworthy people in the email chain, whatever, so there's some record of it. So that's the mahar. Putting the marriage contract in writing is significant, right? It's significant. And retaining it. And we've talked about, because the marriage itself is an oral contract. And there's a beautiful element of that. But it is preserved through writing. And the purpose of contracts, of preservation, prevention, etc., are facilitated through the writing. But put the terms in writing, keep copies. And that's why having a proper officiator, so they also keep a copy of the marriage contract, and having the contact witnesses of the contact information of the witnesses is important. Because who are these people? They just put, there's someone called like Muhammad Khan was one of the witnesses. Now, alhamdulillah, our community has lots of Muhammad Khans, so nobody knows which one it was. So putting contact information there is important. Related to that, one of the important aspects of the marriage contract is register your marriage. The best time to register your marriage is either before the nikah or with the nikah. Before, because some officiators don't have the nikah license. Some of them choose not to do it because they don't want to conduct nikah. Like one of the ways I ward off having to do the nikah, also a test of intelligence, right, is simply someone says, could you conduct my nikah? I don't have a marriage license. Oh. The one of them said, you tricked me. I said, how? He says, I could have just gotten the marriage license. It takes 15 minutes, 10 minutes. I said, oh. I didn't say anything further. So you can get it before or with the nikah, but one of the grave mistakes is do not put it off. And one should be wary of saying, okay, we'll get it done after. And this is especially true for women. Right? For women. You can get stuck in an Islamic marriage and then people deny everything. People deny everything. Say, well, they shouldn't. No. Stripped, if anger, other negativity clothes someone's reason, you have to work on the assumption that human beings are a rational animal. Law protects us from each other's animal self. But you are an animal. You're dignified by reason and religion, and never shed the dignifying cloak of reason and religion, but in anger and other things, they are like cattle, but they're more misguided because cattle don't get violent. Cattle, well, they do, but it has less harm than human wrongdoing. In many Muslim countries, it is illegal. It's a criminal offense for a scholar to conduct a marriage without it being registered. Right? So, for example, in Syria, I've seen many of my teachers, they would ask, Sheikh, could you conduct our nikah, this and that? Said the divorce is in process. We'll get it registered as soon as... No. One of them says, ما بدي اطلع في السجن. I don't want to go to jail. Right? And for good reason, because sometimes people from certain wealthier Muslim countries would come to Syria, for example, get married to someone, spend the summer over there, and spend lavishly, but then disappear. Now, there's no record of the person getting married. So in court, you can't, court is based on procedure and process. So this is one of the very important things. Don't put it off. And also, you may be lazy. The other person may be lazy. People use all kinds of emotional and other tricks. So just get it registered in advance or at the marriage. The other thing that is, because if we're talking about marriages, that yes, marriage is a contract, but it has associated sunnahs. Non-public marriages, there's a politically correct way of saying secret marriages, are haram. Secret marriages are haram at many levels. Right? The Prophet ﷺ commanded, "A'linun nikah," announce marriages. So the Maliki position is particularly strict. You can see related answers. But everybody agrees that this is an essential sunnah. In certain situations, you could have a discreet wedding, such that it is public within the family, it's public amongst friends, etc. But there could be particular reasons why one may not publicize it extensively. But you cannot have secret marriages, right? Related to that, one of the reasons you can't have secret marriages relates to usually the first people a marriage is kept secret from is parental permission. Right? The Prophet ﷺ said, it's a Sahih hadith, لا نكاح إلا بولي, that there is no marriage without the guardian. It's related by Ahmad, Tirmidhi, Abu Dawud, and others, a Sahih hadith. So according to a large percentage of Islamic scholarship, marriage without the wali is invalid. And there's details of, does the wali have to conduct the marriage or is their approval sufficient? Either way, but their involvement is important. In the Hanafi school, a woman's marriage without the approval of her father is valid, but it is normally a major sin. Why? Because there's a difference between validity and something being correct. What is the ruling of picking your nose? Have you ever heard any hadith about if you pick your nose in public, you'll go to hell? No. It's not actually sinful. It's not sinful to pick your nose, even in front of others, but it's not proper. It's not proper. So it's some matters related to propriety, or how do you feel if the guy to your right and your left at the masjid were only dressed in a towel from navel to knee? How do you feel? You feel comfortable in the summer Dhuhr prayer, only wearing a towel from navel to knee? No, not in Umrah, like at your local masjid. Okay, you'd be okay. Would you be okay? No, it'd be like I would consider if I haven't started to go somewhere else in the masjid, right? It could be traumatic. It's strange, right? Because there's one thing that, something could be within the limits, but it is against dignity, propriety, tea, etc. But there's a very important principle that we need to be clear about, that when we talk about the ruling of something, the legal ruling of something is the ruling of the action itself, in of itself. So for example, can a man get married without the permission of their parents? In of itself. Yes, it is valid. It's not a condition for them to get married to have parental approval. But that is the ruling of the matter in itself. But practically, rulings have to consider what are the direct implications of your action, the related direct considerations, right? The ultimate ruling, that what is the ruling in your particular case, it has to consider the directly related considerations. And those directly related considerations include, how does this affect your relationship with your parents, for example? Because we know that of the worst of sins is uququl walidain, being bad to one's parents. And of course, being bad to one's parents, meaning is to wrong them in a manner that's recognized to be wrong. If your mother says, you have to make me shakshuka every single morning, it's not your mother's right. It's not your mother's right. You could provide eggs and she could make them. If you can serve her directly, it's recommended, but it's not a right that you make shakshuka. You come from your house to her house and make her shakshuka for breakfast, right? But there's few things that would cause parents as much grief as the children getting married without permission. So this applies to women, it also applies to men. That for a man to get married without seeking the approval of their parents would normally be sinful. Now the parents are not allowed to refuse if the person is a suitable suitor. Okay? There's only a certain limited range of things that are suitable grounds for objection. Otherwise, the parents are wrongdoers. Right? That what is the basic amount of providing a man has to be able to do? It's very limited. It's very limited. And that's why one should learn that, but one should take the means to convince the parents. And almost all parents can be convinced. You just have to have a plan and stick to it. Now, the last element here has to do with the right of divorce. But before that, any questions related to what we have taken so far about the marriage contract? So, a certain parent has said, a good subject, I wish 50 years ago we were taught this by our teachers. No comment. Any questions? Okay. The right of divorce, right, is an important matter. Why? Because divorce is something that within marriage, the default, and there's a divine wisdom in it and a test, that the husband is granted divorce. Right? And that's a fitna for him. Right? It's a fitna. And that's one of the grave tests in marriage. And it's meant to serve as a deterrent, that don't do it. Don't do it. But Allah tests us as part of our moral responsibility in this life. لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا. To test you which of you acts right. And there's certain things that are meant to be testing. And this is one of the tests in marriage for men. Because sadly, and most people, when they engage in divorce, do so in foolish ways, in wrongful ways, in hasty ways. And that's a problem. But the right of divorce can be specified for a woman, if she chooses for it to be specified. If she chooses for it to be specified. How? Right? How? By either asking for it or agreeing to it at the time of marriage or after. So divorce has actually many benefits. Okay? That if two people can no longer remain together in good, and there's no reasonable expectation of the good being restored, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, عَاشِرُهُنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ أَوْ فَارِقُهُنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ. Live together in the good or part in good ways. And of course, it's not immediately. Jack and Jill have lots of fights. Doesn't mean they get divorced. Seek to restore the good, but if you can't restore the good, and there's no reasonable hope of restoring the good, then there's an option, and there's steps. You maybe seek separation, counseling, many, many steps, but ultimately, if there's no hope for the restoration of good, then divorce is actually a good option. Divorce also has obvious harms, and it's a test. There's a great wisdom that divorce counts. Now, we're not going to look at the fiqh of divorce, but women can also have the right of divorce. Because how does a woman get out of a situation of harm? So by default, if a woman seeks to get out of marriage, she would either ask for divorce and the husband agree. And if he's a person of reason and religious principle, he might just give her just willfully, just divorce her. Number one. Or number two, he could agree to khula, to let her go. And the khula, if it's because he is being abusive, the wrong is due to him, he has no right to the mahar, to demand the mahar back, or to not pay the mahar. That money would be sinful for him. He'd have to return it. But if it is because the woman is the one in a state of non-fulfillment of rights, but she wants out. She doesn't want to fulfill the rights. Right? Then she can repay the mahar, but the problem with khula is that ultimately the man has to agree. In traditional societies where there's the notion of honor and family, and there's non-legal institutions that would bring the two people back together or get people to act in dignified ways, this might be a reasonable option. One night I was working in Jordan and I heard the sound, very distressful sound, of a woman obviously getting hit and screaming. Next morning at Fajr, my landlord said, "Did you hear that disgraceful sound last night?" I said, I was quiet. He said, "I apologize on behalf of our whole family. It won't happen again." I'm wondering, how won't it happen again? He said, "We gave him a piece of our mind and gave him a good beating." Now, that's not necessarily the right Islamic thing to do, but it happened. Said he won't be doing it again. Otherwise, she's going back to her family. Right? And this is a non-legal. I actually, in Jordan, for example, to a tribal society, several times went with the family of my friend. Not only the parents go to see the other party's parents, the whole tribe, like literally 150 people, went from one side to the other. And they talked to each other, emphasized that we as Bani Abbad, for example, we will take care of your daughter, and so on. But we don't have those kinds of things of people making sure, people living in extended families, etc., people having a sense of trust, etc. So in the absence of that, and then a woman could go to court. But the Muslim court system has been destroyed. Why? Historically, where was qada supposed to be? Where is a court supposed to be established? In a Muslim society. So someone said it, in the masjid. At the time of the Prophet ﷺ, qada was in the Prophet's mosque. And we know even afterwards, during the time of the Khulafa, once Sayyidina Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala anhu was sitting where the Prophet ﷺ was sitting, judging between people. So his daughter, Sayyidah Aisha, was looking at him, judging. But she got lost in thought of Rasulullah ﷺ. But then Sayyidina Abu Bakr came and asked her, what are you thinking about? Because she didn't even notice that he got up. And she was reflecting on Sayyidina, on the description of the Prophet ﷺ given by his uncle when he was young. And she had tears in her eyes. And he had tears in his eyes. Said, Wallahi kana kadhalik. By Allah, he was that way. Right? And they're beautiful lines. They're outside the topic here. You can read it in any biography. So qada was in the masjid. But the idea is that justice is meant to be fair, but is also not meant, because justice delayed is not justice properly served. Right? And the whole idea of having lawyers and so on, lawyers are amongst the worst creatures on earth. Right? Because they're not a means of securing justice. They're just a fancy way for another group of people making undeserved money in society. And in general, it's not good to be an agent for anything, because agents are just agents of self-benefit, right? Because agency is a trust. When you act on behalf of someone, you're supposed to be acting for their best interest. But in most cases, any agent, a lawyer is an agent, a real estate agent, all these people, they're typically not acting in the best interest of the person they're acting on behalf of. So certainly the scholars and the righteous throughout history have said that of the worst of things you can do in life is to be an agent. Why? Because you're pretending to act in someone's interest, but you're only acting on your own behalf. Which is why also a lot of the ulama said, don't become a doctor. Because being a doctor is also a trust. What are you supposed to do? You're supposed to actually take care of the health of the person who's entrusting your health with. But doctors basically just want a client. Right? They want a client. They don't want to heal you, because let's say if they dealt with your problem, you won't be an ongoing client. Right? So anyways, that's just something to think about what you should be doing in life, but be trustworthy. Right? So a woman can have the right of divorce in the absence of the societal preservation of her right, of her Islamic right, in the absence of there being functioning Shari'i courts. And this is a reality even in Muslim societies where we've embraced, we are still in a post-colonized mindset that our institutions are colonial institutions, but they're the worst versions of those colonial institutions. Right? And the emperor or the colonizer has no clothes. Right? Marriage through the court system is ugly, brutal, and devastating. So what does one do? What does one do? Right? So a woman can have the right of divorce specified in several ways. The simplest, that if they dispute, she can request the right of divorce. And assuming a principled, whether rationally principled or religiously principled husband, he could give her the right of divorce. That, okay, if you feel that I cannot fulfill your rights, I give you the right, O Jill, to divorce yourself in the majlis. And then within that session, she can choose, do I want to be out or not? She gives him an opportunity. Prove that you're going to address this. If he doesn't, say, okay, I'm not convinced, I want out, I divorce myself from you. That can be a spot choice, to have the choice of divorce. She can also request divorce. Please marry me. Please divorce me. Right? Of course, in the Hanafi school, you can coerce your husband to divorce you, but this is disputed upon between the schools. There's one female, but of course, act with self-interest, but within limits. During the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there's a woman, she wanted divorce. The husband loved her. He wouldn't. So the hadith is differed upon, but she waited till the man was asleep and she sat on his chest with a dagger at his neck. And she woke him up and said, Wallahi, la tutalliqannani aw la athbahannak. Said, by Allah, you will divorce me or I will slaughter you. So he divorced her. And then he went to the Prophet ﷺ and said, this is what happened. The Prophet ﷺ just commented, it happened. There's difference of opinion within the schools of Sunni Islam that is divorce under coercion valid or not. But one can request it. Ideally not in a dramatic manner such as the one described. One could request it. And one is not allowed to do anything unethical like make threats and so on. But thirdly, one can specify the right of divorce in the marriage, right? In the marriage contract, or even after, yeah? Because there are other options, seeking khula, but the guy has to agree, seeking annulment, but seeking annulment, or just to convince him to divorce requires his agreement, right? These require his agreement, and he may not agree. He may not agree. So then what do you do in that kind of situation, right? So the very practical way of securing one's right as a woman, that in the event of things going wrong, or the good that you wanted to pursue in life not being fulfilled, and you don't have the social, Islamic, legal, and other recourses to get out of your Islamic marriage, right? To seek annulment, etc. Although it should be noted that there are religious councils that do conduct annulment. But the problem with annulment, fasakh, is that it functions a bit like the legal system. Right? They need proof. They have to follow protocol. But also, is the legal system in Canada fast or slow? So why is it slow? One of the reasons, one, because it's a poor system, but number two, it's underfunded. Underfunded. Now, is our community very well funded? Things don't happen by magic. You know, the angels just don't step in when human beings are negligent. So our communities are not well funded. So, you know, religious councils that handle annulments and stuff aren't done, you know, they're underfunded and the institutions are weak. So in this, when there isn't this reasonable recourse, then one can specify the right of divorce within the marriage itself. This can be unconditional. To have an unconditional right of divorce. Jack marries Jill, right? So he says, so Jill says, I, Jill bint Bill, agree to marry you, offer to marry you, that, with the stipulation of an unconditional right of divorce. Or she could mention it with the conditions agreed upon, and this is put in writing. Right? So it could be an unconditional right of divorce. Of course, this has the downside that anytime she's upset and she chooses to exercise the right of divorce, it counts, because divorce counts. So it depends, right? If you want it, it's there. But it can be dangerous. Or to have a conditional right of divorce, which is that any conditions that you stipulate, if they're not met, or if any particular things that happen, then if that happens, you can exercise the right of divorce. It could be anything. It says, if you ever drink pina colada, I will... No, so that's... Okay, so we'll get to that with the marriage agreement. It is up to the two parties. If she says, let's say she's allergic to pina colada. Does he have a right to drink pina colada? Yeah. But she says, if you drink pina colada, I have, because the marriage is a contract. So she could stipulate the right of divorce on anything. Now, should she? That's a separate matter. But anything that's within the realm of the permissible, there's different opinion of the scholars. Can you condition the permissible? In a contract, you can. In a contract, that you can. Yeah. So we look at so it can be anything. It can be anything. That, for example, let's say there's a sister who is, since childhood, she was very active in the community. If you prevent me from pursuing my Islamic studies or from being active in the community without neglecting my duties as a wife, I will exercise the right of divorce. Now, one shouldn't be like, divorce is like, one should be trigger happy with divorce. So one shouldn't say like, if you don't cook for me, I will divorce you. If shouldn't do things like that. But there's certain significant conditions. There's certain significant conditions. 4 that are commonly mentioned. One is in the case of abuse. In the case of abuse, if there's clear physical or other abuse, and then one can define it more fully. I wouldn't say it in the spoken contract, but in the written contract, one could even give a stipulation of that. Now, there's difference between a mistake and abuse. And one does not, it is wrong to allow oneself to remain in a situation of abuse, Islamically. So, if that happens, this is one of the cases. Of course, before even one exercises the right of divorce, one gets out of a situation of harm. Because what happened once will happen again. So it requires it requires addressing. So that's, that would be outside the scope. What does one do in abusive situations, etc.? We deal with it in our Islamic marriage courses, but this is one of the situations that one wants to cover. If there's physical or other types of abuse, and it gets very bad. Right? The second is consistent non-provision. Consistent non-provision. Many people, sadly, are negligent. I have someone, I tried hard to convince them otherwise, but this is true in some cultures, that they have misinterpretation of religious teachings, but also they have a tribal sense, because there's a hadith that is wrongfully used, that أَنْتَ وَمَالُكَ لِأَبِيكَ, you and your property are your father's. And some of our literalist brethren, we can call the BADs, the brethren who are attitudinally divergent, they have these misinterpretations, that you and your property are your father's. Firstly, that could not literally be true, because you are your father's. Can you sell your own property? Yes. Can you sell off your children? No. So you don't legally belong to your parents. So it's not the first part, that you are your parents' is not legally true. You're your parents', you're their children. Okay? And your wealth is your children's, that does not apply. Can your father just sell your house? No. Can your father just take your money? No. Right? So the vast majority of the scholars, besides a literalist minority, who affirm that this hadith is to emphasize the greatness of the parents' rights. But it's not literally meant necessarily. So, non-provision, giving the whole check to the parents but not providing for one's wife. But of course, one needs to know what are the Islamic limits of reasonable provision, because some people can just be very negligent. One of the very practical ways, if the husband is earning, one of the ways to avoid dispute is give a monthly amount to the wife. What she does with her monthly amounts, up to her. She wants to just drink pina colada daily. You could give her advice that too much so many sweetened drinks may lead to diabetes or whatever, but it's her money. She can do whatever she wants with it. What's your money? It's a different matter. Third is disappearance. Disappearance. He just disappeared. Whether due to contingencies, he got in jail. Or some people decide to move back home. And they can't be heard from. Right? So, in that kind of situation, it can then be difficult. How do you track him down and this and that? If you specify the conditional right of divorce, all you have to do is you can just pronounce it alone in the room. You record yourself in video. It says, I, Jill bint Bill, hereby divorce myself from Jack ibn Beanstalk. That's it. She's out of the marriage. Now she does her iddah and that's done. Okay, so that simplifies. The fourth is any other terms that they agree to. And this could include the terms that are in the marriage agreement. Okay. I've dealt with situations where a sister, the husband says, I'm not emotionally ready for children, 10 years into the marriage. She wants to have children. Or other things. Right? So, properly speaking, as the sister asked, these should be things that are of significance. But it could be things that are insignificant. Right? So, when we look at some of the things that can and should be defined in the section on the marriage agreements, but practically, one should use a good marriage contract template. One should use a good marriage contract template, right, for the reasons that we've looked at. And one should work on it. Work on these elements that are within the marriage contract itself. And it's good to consult experienced expert scholars. And we have, inshallah, we'll be sending you a sample Muslim marriage contract. There's just a skeletal framework. There's other elements of the marriage contract which are not required, that get it designed nicely, etc. But the contract isn't the floral elements. The contract is really the substance, is what matters. I know people who've signed marriage contracts that are so stunningly beautiful. Did you read what's there? No. The scholars of the subcontinent, early in the 20th century, they worked on this issue of having marriage contracts in India during British rule to ensure that the woman's rights are protected. So they have by default the option to specify the conditional right of divorce. But people just get there's this sense of social stigma, whatever. It has nothing to do with deen. So one of the defaults they do on most, they call them nikah namas, they strike out that section. That nikah nama, the aqd nikah, that sample marriage contract, was put together by ulama. I said, oh, this is a shame on our family. What does shame on our family mean? Okay. Allahu ahaqqun yustaha minhu min nas. Allah is more deserving of our shame than people are. Right? That's there for good reason. Partly because what did the British do in India? There's a special place in hell for colonialists. They say, okay, they shut down the Muslim legal system. They came up with this devilish contraption called the Anglo-Muhammadan Muslim law code. And if a woman wanted to get out of her marriage, all she had to do was to commit ridda, to commit apostasy, to get out of the marriage. It's a bit of a religious problem. Of course, this has been dealt with 8 centuries before, that such ridda, such apostasy is not considered apostasy, because she didn't really leave Islam. But, so they dealt with this. And there's a remarkable female academic, Dr. Fariha Khan, who did her PhD on this, and she studied this with the ulama. Anyways, so use a good marriage template for this and work through it. You can build your own too. You can build your own, look at what elements you want, what you want to include in your ijab and qabul. It's not just something that you're surprised by at the wedding ceremony, etc. Right? So this is the marriage contract. Any questions here before we proceed? Because the last session we're going to look at why you should probably have a marriage agreement. You don't need to, but we'll look at some of the benefits of doing so. Any questions here? So there's a question, if your parents have already selected some matches for you, you don't have to agree. Doesn't matter if they say, I'm going to die if you don't marry, so on. It's your, who you marry is your choice. You should consider what your parents say. You shouldn't have a negative attitude. I cannot marry someone my parents suggest. That's foolishness. That is emotion rather than reason. Because an emotional animal is basically almost like someone who's insane, right? Because if you just judge on the basis of emotion, emotion is not reliable. So you're essentially insane, right? So emotional beings are like mad people, except that they stay within certain norms most of the time. And one of the things one shouldn't do is marry a purely emotional person, because you might as well marry someone who's insane. And they say that an intelligent enemy is better for you in life than a foolish friend. Right? Because the intelligent enemy, you can anticipate what they will do. But the foolish friend, you have no idea what they'll do. Anyways, okay. But that's outside the scope. Who you choose to marry, that's something that's very significant, but that's not part of the marriage contract. Of course, you have to consider carefully who the other party is. Once my sister was mentioning, she was sitting with some young women, and one said, I know I have only one criteria for the person I want to marry. My sister was quite impressed. What is that? It says he has to have 2 eyebrows. Now, how does that relate to a successful marriage, right? But that's outside the scope. We have several courses on Islamic marriage. You can look at that there. There's a question that if the option for her to initiate a divorce is crossed, then can she still initiate it if it meets the conditions mentioned? No, but if she didn't specify the right of divorce, then either he has to agree to giving her a divorce, the right to divorce, or he has to agree to divorcing her, or he has to agree to khula, or she could seek mediation or arbitration, but he has to agree to that. Or the families can put pressure, etc. There's non-legal routes. And sometimes they have to be taken. A certain amount of ethical pressure is good. In Damascus, one of my friends, the landlord was asking for a year's rent up front, otherwise he was going to evict him. So one of the scholars said, where does he live? So he basically had some of the youth or the young men who frequent the streets go and like threaten him a little bit, just, khalik wa'i, just stay sensible. Otherwise, they made some credible threats just to get him not to wrong the guy. So sometimes there's a call to be an ethical gangster, right? Well, an ethical gangster doesn't do anything haram or illegal, but you put someone in place. Right? So you can't name and shame, you can't do this. But sometimes a certain amount of ethical gangsterism is required for the restoration of rights. But you should consult. Don't take that into your own hands. Okay. So we're going to take a 2-minute break, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, and then come back for the final session on the marriage agreement itself. Inshallah, we have some snacks and so on, and we will be back shortly for those of you who are online. Just 2 minutes. Barakallahu ta'ala feekum. ضيعت Which folder is it in? Okay. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. We'll be starting shortly. Bidnillahi ta'ala. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Before we start, there's a couple of questions that came up online that what does one do in a situation where the husband, so they don't have the conditional right of divorce, and the husband refuses to give her the right of divorce or refuses to do khula, etc. Then in most Muslim communities, there is, so sometimes one can involve the families or leaders in the community. And then if you consult the leaders in the community, there's also religious councils that facilitate the matter of the annulment of marriage. These are done with discretion because people misportray them as being quote unquote Sharia courts and the like, but they're not anything such. If two people agree, it's like binding arbitration. We can agree to arbitration. If people agree to for Bobo the clown to arbitrate between them, that's up to them. And this is done through due process. But of course, inwardly one turns to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And one gets oneself out of any situation of clear harm. Right? It's also spiritually important to realize that you are not alone. Right? You have Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with you, but there are circles of mercy. In some situations, family can be a circle of mercy. Sometimes it can be trustworthy friends. Sometimes it can be leaders, trustworthy leaders in the community, etc. So there are different circles of mercy. Our religious teachings are mercy. Right? So, right? And in those, you need, there's a spiritual turning for support to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's religious support. There is social support through family, through friends, through community, through scholars, through leaders. And sometimes there's institutional support as well. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. Okay. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina wa Nabina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wasallam. In the third and final session, we're going to look at why you probably would benefit from having a marriage agreement and what are some of the key things to include in such an agreement. Now, marriage agreements are not strictly speaking required. It would make sense before marriage for the two parties to agree on the things that are of significance to them. Now, if societies are stable, then there is great wisdom in there being social, cultural, and other types of norms. Because norms give us facilitative defaults by which to act. And defaults are very useful for human beings because you don't have to think about it. You don't have to think about it. You just do what other people are doing, and a lot of stuff is facilitated. And that's why different societies at different times come to norms. Now, we are not bound by those norms. We're not bound by their norms. If your family only marries from your own clan, that's a familial norm, but you're not bound by that. You're not bound. We talked about that earlier. I have a friend who calculated there's only 2 women who, in his family, he was considered eligible to marry. Because their family had juts and butts, B-U-T-Ts. And their family thing was, you must marry a jut and no one but, B-U-T-T. But amongst the buts, there's other criteria. She has to be younger than you. She has to have similar but lesser economic status than you. She has to be this, that. So ultimately, there's only 2 women in the family he could have married. And one was already married. There's only one person that he was eligible to marry. That's nothing religious. That's nothing religious. Right? And religion has come to free us from these kinds of bounds. There is a great role for culture and cultural norms, for society and social norms. These are beautiful things. Is there an Islamic expectation that you open the door for somebody? No. But this is a good social norm. Okay. There's other social norms that are good. Like, will you go to hell for putting your elbow on the table while eating? No. But we uphold social, but you're not bound by it. You've got a bad back and you're leaning ahead to eat. Okay? And you can't hold it against someone for doing something like that. So, in marriage agreements, the reason marriage agreements are important is that the key aim of Islamic teachings is the preservation of good, worldly and religious, and the prevention of harm. And marriage in our times has varying expectations. And there's what one can call civilizational flux. Whether we are in immigrant communities of people whose parents or grandparents or great-grandparents migrated to the countries we're living in, but also in Muslim societies due to still living through PTSD, post-colonial stress disorder, and all kinds of external influences. So, in that, as what we quoted from Raghib al-Isfahani on the importance of agreements, that contracts and agreements aren't needed in the presence of love. But when love is threatened, nothing restores love like agreements. These agreements are promissory. They're commitments that each party makes. They're not contractually binding. They don't annul the contract. But you cannot make a promise that you do not have the intent to fulfill. So don't commit to something that you cannot uphold. Such as, for example, Jack and Jill went up the hill and both fell in love. So Jack declared that he wanted to marry Jill in the presence of Uncle Bill. All examples are assumed to be halal, right? So Jill said, you're suitable. However, I love my hometown. I do not wish to travel. Now, if he promises that he won't, he is morally bound by that, because this is a promise that another's action is made on the basis of. In general, the ruling on promises have two parts: making the promise and keeping the promise. In general, if, let's say, someone random from the Alwan clan said, I'll come and help you move tomorrow. You cannot make the promise unless you have the firm commitment to fulfill. But actually fulfilling the promise is a sunnah, because you may have work responsibilities. And other things may come up that may prevent you from being able to fulfill the promise. So that's in general. But if you make a promise that another's significant, or materially significant action or life significant action was dependent upon, then such a promise is morally binding to fulfill as well. You go to a baker and said, if you were to bake me 1,000 croissants, I'll buy them from you tomorrow morning for $2,500. So they stayed up all night and all morning making the croissant, but there's no contract. But that's a promise that you are morally bound to keep, and actually in the fatwa, certainly in later scholarship, is that you could be taken to court for that promise too. Right? Because there's a materially significant action based on that. Now, there's a moral duty to fulfill. So this can be linked to the right of divorce, both for the woman but also for the husband, because divorce can carry a stigma. But the husband could stipulate, for example, that he does not wish, let's say Jack and Jill were living in Turkey, but Jack doesn't want to come back to Canada. For whatever reason, it's his life, it's his choices. Jack and Jill got married, and he says, look, on agreement that we will remain in Turkey or wherever, we will remain in Punjab. And if you, at any point, decide to move back to Canada, I will exercise, it's my prerogative to exercise the right of divorce. Now, technically, he could divorce her anyways, but the reason he may choose to do this is so that people don't rebuke him. Why did you divorce her? Well, I made it clear in our agreement that I did not wish to leave Canada for, or whichever country. So it can be linked to the right of divorce. And there's a fourth benefit of agreements, which is to clarify expectations and give a basis for restoring agreements. And you could have loads of things. You could have loads of things. But it's best not to be frivolous. Right? So, Zubayr and Zubaydah is really into fitness, so she says, you will exercise at least 5 days a week. Otherwise, and she connects it to the right of divorce. That's a bit drastic because, we want to facilitate agreement, not trigger reasons for further argument. One of the most important things to specify is how finances will be handled. There's a simple Islamic basis. Firstly, Islamically, it is the husband's obligation to provide for the family, even if the woman is wealthy. That's default number one. Number two, Islamically, the wife's money is hers. The wife's money is hers. But also, it is also true that Islamically, the husband's money is his. Right? He has a duty to provide for her, but his money is his. Right? And the preservation of property applies to everybody. Everyone's property is theirs, including the child. If your child is given $100 by An uncle, who does the money belong to? It belongs to the child. The parent can only use the money in the direct interest of the child. You say, well, the kid plays in the backyard, so if we build a porch, no. Right? So that's just the general principle. So the wife's money is hers, but so is the husband's. And property is not shared by default. Whoever bought it, it's theirs. In traditional Muslim societies, it's very common for women to have businesses or ways that they accumulated money. If you look at throughout history, manuals of fiqh written for women, they had sections on trade and partnerships and different modes of investment. I asked one of my teachers why, and he said because only a foolish person would just become purely dependent on another, especially given the possibility of death. Not a possibility, it's a certainty. Right? So this idea that, well, the wife must stay home and she mustn't work, and we have this fuzzy monetary agreement called common property law, which is just messy, that who owns what, it's very subjective. It's a mess. Right? And it leads to all kinds of problems. So how do you handle this? Right? Because now you may have the fortune of just remaining poor, so there's no money, there's no argument. Right? But let's say you made some money. It'll lead to dispute. Now you could solve it in court, but how do you resolve it between the two of you? The guy says, look, he suddenly made $10 million. Jill says 50% mine. Now Jack and Jill are having some trouble. If she could get out of the marriage and get $10 million at the time, there's an incentive. So there's all kinds of funny stuff that can happen. So how finances will be handled is very important. These are defaults, right? That the husband must provide, the wife's money is hers, his earnings are his. Property isn't shared by default, but you can agree on pretty much anything. But have it in writing. Have it in writing, even when one parent passes away. Big argument. Who does the house belong to? Well, it's in the father's name, but he bought it for the mother. He said it's your house, but who has the title deed? And then how does the inheritance get split? There are situations where children have forced the remaining parent out of the house and they no longer talk over things like this. So defining ownership, particularly of the significant things, such as property. Whose is the property? Whose are the investments, the savings, etc.? It's best to just have it in writing. Do you accept common property law? But how does common property law have to do with accumulated wealth, to ownership of house, to savings, investments, things like that? The things that have material significance. This is very important because this is one of the primary causes of disputes and divorce in marriage, not just amongst Muslims, but also in wider society. So you agree in advance. And there, it's a reason. Your sister says, okay, I won't work, but I want 50% of everything, and she has it in writing, including our accumulated wealth, and he agrees to it in writing. And he's held himself to that. So that later, if they're having a dispute, say, well, it's my right to sell the house. She say, no, but we've agreed that this is 50% mine. Now, in the dispute, you can assume that when people fight, they take off their jackets. So the jacket of reason, the shirt of religion will be taken off, right? Rather, the animal clause will be out. So this brings things back. The second is children. People have disputes about all kinds of things related. Children agree to that in advance. When you'll have children? What are the guiding principles on raising children? Someone says, I do not want to send my kids to school, to public school. Someone says, I do not want to send my kids to private school. One says, I must homeschool. The other says, we will not homeschool. So, and other such details. Now, you don't have to solve all of them, but at least have guiding principles related to that, especially if something's very dear to you. Right? Have it in writing. Working and education. Right? That the basis is that there's certain prioritization of a man's role, a woman's role. But someone gets married to someone who's trying to become a doctor and they're specializing. It may take 10, 12, maybe 15 years till they've finished all their specialization. Wife says, no, I want you to start working because things are very tight. He said, no, but you married. I still have a lot of specialization to do. Right? So this could apply to men, frequently applies to women. Right? That husband says, I don't want you to work. She said, no, but you married somebody who is a medical doctor. I'm a professional. This is something that's dear to me. So this is something you need to work through. Right? And the best time to agree to it is in advance. And it's best to put it in writing so it doesn't lead to dispute. It also can help think through some of these critical decisions oneself. Balance. How do you strike a balance? Right? One of the, like if you have two objects, how do you balance them? A balance is not necessarily down the middle. Right? You can strike a balance between things in different ways, and there are different circumstances that are feasible. I know people who agreed that they wanted to marry the wife's a medical doctor. She's already a medical doctor. She's older than him. He's studying for his PhD. They agree in writing that, look, we'll get married, but for the first 5-6 years, I'll be providing. But if we have kids, you take care of the kids, the guy. But I'll assist you in doing your PhD, and then, they'll flip roles. That's an unusual agreement, but they agree to it. Right? But it's better than fighting it out. I want to do my PhD. I want to work. No. And they come to some kind of tragicomic solution. So these things one should agree upon in advance. Religious and community engagement. If it's important to you, agree to it in writing, because in dispute, people won't behave rationally. Say, well, I used to attend halakas, or I used to do this beforehand. Wife says, no, but I want you to come to all the family gatherings. He says, no. On weekends, I attend study circles, I'm involved in the community, this and that. So, these things, if these are important to you, include them. There could be other social engagements too. You play golf. It was really significant to you. You go once a month golfing. It's important. Wife says, I don't, she's upset, or vice versa. So agree to these matters that are significant to you. It could be religious and community engagement, could be other matters. Living arrangements is also a significant matter. A woman has a right to what's called a bayt shar'i. That she has right to minimally her own private room, living space, of course, and then private access to washroom and kitchen. And then depending on the finances, this could be separate from anyone else, so that separate from parents, if they have limited means, maybe it would be shared kitchen space, but this be according to societal norms. Now, in the ulama say practically that means they have an independent house, because if you have a shared house, most parents won't respect the right that, well, the wife doesn't want to have every meal with the parents. So saying, well, we're separate but together doesn't generally work. So practically that she has a right to this Beit Shari, she has her own living space. But there are many complicating circumstances, right? That if the husband says, no, I have made a life commitment that from the time my parents are 55, I will be supporting them and they will be living with me. I will be, okay, great, you want to do that. But Jack wants to do that, but Jill doesn't. It's better to disagree on that before they marry and don't get married than to get married and then fight it out. Because you can't square a circle, right? It's either circle or square. It can't be both. And this is where how one handles in-laws differs. A lot of times in Muslim societies, this is an unreasonable expectation. And throughout history, Imam al-Ghazali cautioned, and you can find it in his book of marriage in the Ihya, against living too close to the parents. Said that the right thing is to be close enough so that you can visit them frequently, but not so close that they meddle in your affairs. But different people have different family circumstances. In many places, they would have family homes, and you have extended families. Extended families have many merits. There's shared labor. There's a lower workload on the members of the family, or there's more female capital for cooking fancy meals. So there's not less work. There's just more resources for fancier familial output. But these are things that they need to come to agreement on, right? On living arrangements. But the basic thing is that the woman has the right not to live with her parents, not to live with her in-laws. But a man could choose that, no, I want to live with my parents. I want my parents to live with me. Then how do you resolve it? Neither party can just unilaterally impose this on the other. Then what do you do? But even if a woman does agree to live with her in-laws, she can retract that later. She can retract it because many things can arise. So this is one of the most sensitive of matters. There's a related thing that happens more often than people realize, which is the issue of traveling overseas. If you get married somewhere, the assumption is that's the place you got married. And it has legal implications, right? Because if Jack is from the UK and Jill is from Canada, but they decide to get married in front of the Prophet ﷺ's mosque in Medina, where did they get married? Okay, they got, oh, beautiful, you got married in Medina. But where are you going to live? For sure, the Saudis won't let you live there. So what is your home country? Now, the default is, where would Jack want to live? He wants to live in his home country. Jill wants to live in her home country. So how do you resolve that? And it gets messy. But also a lot of understanding things come. So, well, what I understood is we're going to stay a few years in the US, then we'll go back to Canada. So what do you mean go back to Canada? I'm not a Canadian citizen. And they have all kinds of argument. A lot of people have the go back home itch. So, Sister Layla grew up in a particular country. She didn't have a good experience for whatever reason. Layla's husband, Amir, wants to move back home. He loves Beirut. She hates Beirut. Now, ultimately, if they can't agree, then they would have to part ways or whatever anyways. But in this, the right thing to do is to agree on those things. Practically, there's difference of opinion. The Hanafis generally say that if a woman has the right to refuse to travel overseas, if it would mean that she is away from her family and her community or society that she's accustomed to, that there would be wahsha. She would be a stranger in that land. Because being a stranger is not an easy thing for most people. So this is one of those things that, like living arrangements, the issue of traveling overseas is an issue that comes. Many people are now consulting recently with a lot of the values-based fuzziness arising in many Western countries. Many people have always had the notions of going to some imaginary homeland. If you ever read a fascinating novel called The Journeys of Ibn Fattuma by Naguib Mahfouz, about this land called Gabal, this ideal land. So people sometimes have that everything will be perfect if we go to such and such place in the world. No. Things are good if you fix your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is living arrangements, and where you live is a fifth matter. A sixth matter is how will you resolve disputes? Simple thing. To agree on a dispute resolution mechanism. We cover this and some of the practicalities of it in our course on Islamic marriage at Seekers Guidance, that agree on a dispute resolution mechanism. Because you will fight. You will fight. How will you fight? Set some terms for the fight. Okay? So agree on a dispute resolution mechanism. What is the basis on which you will resolve things? Even, and that idea of, people will shed the cloak of dignity, the cloak of religion, the cloak of reason. So, but he's so religious. The number of times someone, male or female, in dispute will pay no attention to the limits of Allah and His Messenger, legal or moral or of conduct. It's not surprising, because underlying everything, you're just an animal. That is your lower self. Inna nafsa la'amaratun bisu. Truly, the lower self is ever commanding to ill. That's except those who Allah has mercy on, that they will choose religion, choose reason. Also, do you agree to someone to be a recourse for resolving things? Jack and Jill may have parents who would be conducive to the two parties resolving things. And sometimes it's a very good thing. But in some situation, it's like adding fuel to the fire. That you're making kebab and the fuel's getting too strong. So what do you decide to do? You decide to pour oil on the fuel. It won't solve things. It will make things worse. Some of the suggested steps on how to resolve disputes. So this is outside the scope here, but in the Islamic marriage course, for example, I think lessons 10 and 11, we look at some of these dispute resolution mechanisms, how they agree to talk to each other when they dispute. What will be the criteria by which they'll resolve dispute? What will they do in the event of divorce? How will they handle, especially if there's children involved, etc., how will they handle issues of child custody, this and that? But they can at least morally agree that we agree to handle these. That how do you handle the interface between the rulings of the Sharia on the one side, but also how does that interplace with custody laws? And custody laws, depending on where you are, can be very messy. Okay? But having some agreement on these is of merit. There's many other things you can agree upon. Right? You can agree on pretty much anything. Right? Some are frivolous and some can't be binding. If they agree that we will only wear white or black, is this a matter of significance? No. So that is considered a frivolous promise. Right? Now you should, if you break it, you should just make tawbah. That's astaghfirullah, we did something foolish. Maybe give a little bit of money in charity, just yes, token amount, just for but you're not bound by the purely frivolous. There's clothing is not only black and white, but sometimes people agree to very strange things. So I won't mention what. Alhamdulillah, my wife doesn't remember. We'd agreed to some pretty strange things in our marriage agreement. We'd been reading some very strange books when we got married. So, alhamdulillah, selective memory's a good thing in life. So we sort of redrafted the terms of our marriage agreement before any trouble would happen. 'Cause I'm lazy, so I sit thinking for too long. So part of getting the food blender also got rid of some of those secondary commitments that were not binding or which are not tenable. So those are some of the things that we wanted to highlight, that if you can have that in writing, and this is separate from the marriage agreement. So you have a marriage contract and you sign on to that. You have a marriage agreement and you sign on to that and you keep both. Parents don't have to see the marriage agreement. Because some of the things you may not, it's up to you. It's not a requirement for husband and wife to see the specifics of the marriage agreement. That's between the two couples. Because certain things that both sets of parents want grandchildren right away. You guys have some other agreement. That's between the two. You could consult them, but that's not required. And sometimes it can make things complicated. Even the conditional right of divorce, some parents freak out about that. Said, you are intending to divorce your husband? I said, no, that's not what it's about. But they just can't deal with it. So one doesn't, they agree to the marriage. Their agreement is required for the marriage itself. Right? For the marriage itself. How much is the mahar, etc.? They have a consultative voice, basically. Part of respecting parents is respect their opinion, at the very least to see where they're coming from and why. Saying, Beti, they're wealthy, you should demand at least 150,000, if not 200,000 in mahar. But you know the details. Jack doesn't have $200,000. Right? He has it, but it's in investments, whatever. That's not realistic. Right? So that's between the couple. Right? That's between the couple. But do involve parents in the process, but some of the details can get messy. So exercise your discretion and wisdom. وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. We have some time for questions. There's a question that what in our prenup contracts halal? Prenup agreements morally are not. What is the legal status in court of a prenup agreement depends where you are. In different jurisdictions, even sometimes within certain countries, it can depend on the state or province you're in. That's a separate matter. We're not talking about what is the court enforceability of these. But Islamically, a prenup agreement that's a marriage agreement. These are the things that you do agree to. And you can agree to anything, right? What you cannot demand, what is not allowed, you cannot demand from another that which is not your Islamic right. Right? And that's where you have to be careful. If you want to secure your rights, take the means in advance to secure your rights. Right? Okay, so that's one of the questions online. Any questions here, inshallah? Sorry, this is a bit of a heavy topic, but alhamdulillah. Yeah, so what you can't demand what is not your right. So for example, Just last week I met somebody who, in order to get out of marriage without the in-laws sort of destroying his family's life and businesses and whatever, he had to pay, there was a demand to pay $250,000 to the woman's family upon divorce. And Islamically that's called suht. And that is haram money. You should not agree to it, but even in some situations you have to get out of a bad situation. That is haram money. They're not allowed to hold on to 1 cent of that. It is haram. And the Prophet ﷺ said, يعني كل لحم نبت من سحت فالنار أولى به. That any flesh that is nurtured through haram money, the fire becomes more deserving of them. Likewise, sometimes if the husband demands that I'll divorce you if the girl's family pay this much or you pay this much and it's not rightfully his, or demands the mahar back when he is the abuser, for example, that is not allowed. You're not allowed to demand that which is not rightfully yours. Similarly, in situations where you need to know your rights, right? So you have a right that, okay, if you're not working, you negotiate, you agree in your marriage contract, and in your marriage you have moral capacity, you have moral agency. So you make choices that are advantageous to you, but you cannot, for example, demand that 20, 30 years into the marriage, we affirm, say, okay, now I want half your wealth. And they never agreed to that. Right? And let's say they were living overseas, someone, for example, living in the Gulf where somewhere they don't have common property law. But if you don't do that, then you make threats that you will not have access to the kids and your grandchildren will curse you and all this is unnecessary. And these things, one of the governing principles is in Surah Al-Talaq, 65th Surah, verses 2 and 3. وَمَن يَتَّقِ اللَّهَ يَجْعَلْ لَهُ مَخْرَجًا. And the context of revelation of this is at the time of divorce. Whoever is mindful of Allah, Allah will grant a way out. And being mindful of Allah at the time of divorce is to be careful to fulfill the rights of the other and to be careful not to wrong them while seeking your rights in a right way. وَمَن يَتَّقِ اللَّهَ يَجْعَلْ لَهُ مَخْرَجًا. Allah will grant a way out. And it's expressed with immediacy. It's not Allah will later grant a way out. يَجْعَلْ, Allah grants a way out. وَيَرْزُقْهُ مِنْ حَيْثُ لَا يَحْتَسِبْ. And Allah will provide for them in ways they could never imagine. That applies to men, also applies to women. Right? And that's one of the things. If the woman is taking care of the children, etc., she has custody, the husband, the former husband has the responsibility to provide for them, to facilitate accommodation for them. But he doesn't have to just randomly pay $3,000 to her. Right? But then within the marriage, it's also important for women to be cognizant of their economic well-being. Right? Right? Your husband saying, my husband's taking care of that is, well, maybe he is, but secure your rights. And that's why, there's an Indonesian scholar, Habib Saqaf al-Mahdi, he said, ignorance is of more detriment to the believer than being naked. For you to walk around in society ignorant is to your ultimate detriment, is to greater ultimate detriment than walking around naked. You walk around naked, okay, people shouldn't look at you, it's haram. But inshallah, people will lower their gaze and not harm you. But you walk around ignorantly, forget other people harming you, you're just harming yourself. Right? So be careful. What are the Islamic demands in a marriage? Okay, that's firstly, marriage should never be about demands. Right? That's a very unhealthy way of looking at it. So that's outside the scope of our discussion today. We have several courses on Islamic marriage, particularly the full one. We look at some of that, so that you can see over there. Go ahead. Yeah. So how does the husband's rights or responsibilities towards his parents? So one of the great scholars of the Indian subcontinent wrote a wonderful treatise called Ta'dil Huquq al-Walidain, rebalancing the rights of parents. Because in many cultures, while it's very noble that children take care of the rights of parents, or men take care of the rights of their parents, but should not be to the neglect of their wives or their children. The governing principle is the words of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, "A'ti kulla dhi haqqin haqqahu." Give all who have a right their due right. And part of that is the fundamental right is what is the religious right. A lot of people have fuzzy notions, and that's where grounding ourselves in knowledge is important. That, for example, we say, okay, we want to be good to our relatives. But is going to family gatherings being good to your relatives? Not necessarily, right? Because again, there's 4 fundamental questions. What, why, how, when, or whether. That's how we should think of something, right? Showing up at a family gathering, you neither talk to the person, you're not helping the person, you're not being good to the person, you're just consuming uncle's food, and now uncle's old enough, he's just ordering from Silver Spoon or wherever. Whereas how do you do good to them? Not by showing up, by being the one who visits them when they're sick, assists them when they're in need, etc. So that's how we need to know what are the actual rights and responsibilities. But in terms of providing, a man's responsibility comes first to their children, then to their wife, then to their parents. And if the parents are not financially in need, the child is not obligated to provide. Right? Is not obligated. Right? It is recommended for them to provide to the extent of facilitation. If the parents are in need, then they come third in that right, to the extent of capacity. To the extent of capacity. Yes, the husband has a duty to visit his parents. Technically, the wife doesn't have to visit. Now, if you go on technicalities, that I don't have to do this, I don't have to do this, I don't have to do this, then technically you don't have to do anything. Then you have a dead marriage. Right? Do you have to water your plants? No. But if you don't, they'll die. If you don't water your marriage, it's going to die too. Right? So that's not how it would work. But this is one of the very sensitive things. I think you can find it online. The article, it's translated by the Rebalancing the Rights of Parents by Dr. Fariha Khan. It's part of some stuffy collection of essays about South Asian Islam, but she translated the treatise on rebalancing the rights of parents, and that's very good. That's the framework we use for most of the answers on Seeker's Guidance on that. But rarely is it a matter of A or B. Should I take care of my parents or my family? No. That idea of give each who has a right their due right. And when these things aren't clear, do yourself a favor and consult. Because people have done it before. Can a woman request that her husband not take another wife in the contract? This is differed upon. Firstly, most second marriages are harmful. Most, not all, but most second. So a man marrying more than one woman is clearly established by the Quran, by the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, etc. It's established. So it's intrinsically permissible, and there's a wisdom in it. But then contingently, if you look at 100 second marriages, how many of them are likely to be good without harm or bereft of manifest harm, right? Most of the situations, right? it's an irrational, emotional act. That if marriage number one's not working, then what can you bet on marriage number two? It's not going to work. Rather, you're going to aggravate the problems in marriage number one, and marriage number one is going to the same problems are going to spill over in marriage number two, just complicating a messy life situation. So often it's escapism, or just lust, or whim, or other things. So, and people are, the Arabs say, al-mar'u asiru adatihi. People are prisoners to their norms. It's very hard for women of many different cultural backgrounds, etc., to accept a second wife entering into the equation. So those are things that, if someone's serious about it, this is something to discuss before, and if it's significant. There's some people who say, great. Like I had a Nigerian friend who lived in my neighborhood in Damascus. He had two wives living in that same house, and they're like best friends. Twice it happened over 3 years that he said, Faraz, man, please make dua for my number two. I said, why? Because number one's traveling, number two's really sad. Right? But that's not the normal case. Right? So those are things that, right? Now someone could decide, well, it's up to my husband. Okay, then at least agree to it. But steps like this should not be taken except by consultation. Most of the time, it's practically a bad idea. But just to be clear, because someone once wrote to me saying, you're an enemy of Allah and His Messenger, and this, that, because, it is in itself permissible. It's clearly established in the Quran and the Sunnah for multiple marriage. However, it is not something that is normally something that is advisable, because it contingently typically results in obvious harm. And any kind of second marriage that is a secret marriage is a compound problem. Because not only is it just the fact that it's a second marriage going to be harmful, but never agree to be a secret second wife. That is, firstly, wronging yourself, allowing someone else to wrong themselves and wrong you. And number three, indirectly wronging wife number one and children and so on. But the one who most gets harmed is the second wife, because ultimately the man has more invested in wife number one than in wife number two. It would take something typically quite dramatic for him to leave number one for number two. Doesn't matter what he says, right? So that should not be done. Secret, and typically things like that are done in secret, etc. It is just one set of major mess. But things like, for some people, that's very significant. So at the very least, discuss it out before. If it's significant, it's best just to put it in writing. Because a lot of social norms, well, in our culture, they don't do it, but it's like, I have a friend who's from Kashmir. He said, just randomly messaged me. He said, why do my parents want me to marry a Kashmiri girl? I sent him a question mark. I don't know, like I'm in the middle of work. Then he sent me a picture of a brown bear. I sent 2 question marks. Said, that's a Kashmiri brown bear. I put 3 question marks. What is this? He said, I'm about as compatible to the average Kashmiri girl as I am with that Kashmiri brown bear. Not very. I said, oh. And I made myself change my status to away. Right? Which is true, that very often you say, well, our family doesn't do this. Your family lived in Hyderabad. You've never been to Hyderabad. So what social norms are you talking about? Right? Your family doesn't speak in Hydro Urdu. They don't, so, a lot of those things are very often up in the air, even back home. That's why coming to agreement on them is much better. Say, well, these things are resolved within family. When's the last time you listened to your parents? It's been years. So why would parents be able to resolve something between children who don't really listen to them, except, the token yes, no thing. So it's part of it's to be practical. How are contract terms negotiated in a halal manner between two parties? Would there need to be an intermediary? There doesn't have to be an intermediary. You can pretty much agree to anything, right? If they want to agree, if Jill says, I want to sleep on the ground, okay. You could agree to it, but Jack could say, okay, I want to sleep on a bed, right? So that's not a significant thing, because you can't force Jack to sleep on the ground with you. You can say, it hurts my back. He wants to sleep on a bed, or vice versa. But then those are things that are agreements won't solve. You have to be able to come together to agreement within the marriage. But there's simple solutions for stuff like that. But it can help to involve somebody in it if they know what they're doing and you're willing to listen to them. Any other questions? Go ahead. No, when you make the agreement, you could technically make it at any time. You could get married, and the wedding night, you could stay up till Fajr writing out the marriage agreement, right? But it's best to do it beforehand, right? Because to know what you're getting into. Because let's say someone wants to continue their wedding photography business. Wife's very jealous. Says, I don't want you to go. I don't want you to take pictures of women. But that's my job, right? So you put that in, because you've gotten to know Layla and she's very jealous. Okay? Like I had a situation where the wife said, I don't want my husband to work in marketing. Of course, he doesn't have a right to do that, but those are things that you discuss in advance. I don't want you to talk to any female clients, but you're in sales. Like, what are you going to do? So if it's of significance, discuss it, and it's good to put it in writing too. If it's something of, but you don't really care, then you don't have to specify everything. There's a question, would something which is permissible by Allah and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ be a bad idea? Yes. There's many things that can be a bad idea, right? Because context makes a difference. Right? The Prophet ﷺ, for example, if you look at the hadiths on kuhul, on iktihal, there are numerous hadiths on kuhul. But the ulama differed on its application. Some said that it is only, some of the ulama said this is only before going to sleep. Not during the day, because iktihal, applying kuhul, is a type of adornment. And men don't adorn themselves. Men don't adorn themselves. Others said, no, it's from the sunnahs of habits, but kuhul is only to be used when it is fitting the person's medical temperament. And certain types of things aren't good for everybody. Should you eat dates? Depends on your health circumstances. Right? Depends on your health circumstances, right? So not everything that is allowed in the sunnah is sunnah. Right? Because yes, it's in itself allowed, but in its application, you have to consider circumstances. For example, if you go to your in-laws and they're sitting at the dining table, they say, no, I want to sit on the ground because it's sunnah. It may be haram for you to do that sunnah. Why? Because doing so, you're expressing disrespect to your host. They're sitting on the dining table, you take your plate, sit on the ground, and look up at them. It is disrespecting your host and also making yourself look foolish. And it's also a cause of disrespect for the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Right? So the application of prophetic teachings requires consideration of context. And that requires knowledge. There's many examples of that. In Damascus, one of the very distinguished scholars, Shaykh Rushdi al-Qalam, took me aside and asked me to tell one of the Canadian brothers, because he's wearing his thobe high. And the sunnah is to wear the thobe at shin level. In the saq. And he said, could you explain to the brother? And the brother knows Arabic. That you shouldn't do that because it looks like the dress of the people of innovation. And it's against the social norms of the people of Sham. I said, could you explain it to him? He said, I'm afraid he won't listen to me. I said, well, I'm afraid he won't listen to me either. So he explained it out to me. Right? So I said, let's turn into a question. You ask me about it, and I'll give an explanation. Maybe he'll hear it. So as we're walking, I asked him, Sayyidi, what if I started wearing my thobe? Right? Because in itself, yes, that's from the sunnah. But in its application, you have to look at circumstances. There's numerous examples related to that. One of the great Hanbali scholars, Ibn Badran, who was the mufti of the Hanbalis of Duma a century ago, one of the greatest of the late Hanbalis, he was asked about, quote unquote, men wearing Islamic clothing if they were in Europe. Of course, this is a very different, this is like late 19th century, early 20th century, and there's very few Muslims there. And he said that if this would cause them to be looked down upon in society, it may be impermissible. Because the Prophet ﷺ told us not to, naha an libas al-shuhra, to wear that which would cause us to be singled out negatively and cause us to be unreasonably looked down upon. And that, of course, depends on context. In other situations, right? In other situations, so how one applies prophetic teaching depends on context, right? And there's a difference between should a scholar or a person of knowledge wear religious garb in a minority context vis-a-vis someone else. But those kinds of application, well, just because something was done in the sunnah does not mean we just do that thing, right? Because the sunnah has values, it has a form, but it also has an implementation. And that's why we need knowledge. Right? And there's many, many examples of that. So something like that, second marriage, in anything you have to consider the intention, the action itself, and its likely consequences. Any action where you don't consider why you're doing it, how you're doing it, and to what end, is not an Islamic decision. It's not an Islamic decision. In many circumstances, haram to command the good and forbid the wrong, if it'll cause greater harm. What you're saying is correct, but you have to consider consequences. So that's there's a question, do people have to do a PhD in Islamic law before marriage? No, but you consult. you consult. Right? People spend ages finding about different types of turban cloth, because not every cloth stands straight up. Stands straight up. I calculated there's one guy sitting on a marriage stage. The cloth was at least 4.5 feet above his head. So I actually frivolously looked at how do you keep cloth, because it has to be strongly starched to stay up on its own without support for 4.5 feet. So things like that. So people spend ages discussing whether we will use this type of material or this type of material for the sherwani or for this and that, but you can't spend half an hour just finding out about the framework of something that will affect you for the rest of the life. So that's the thing. There's in Canada, Ontario, what is the difference between provincial and federal marriage contracts and a urfi marriage contract? Okay, so firstly, civil marriage contracts are not, so the marriage contract is a contract, but that has religious elements. So they differ, the scholars differ that marriage, Is it min al-ibadat or is it from the mu'amalat? Is it a devotional act or it's a transactional act? But it is both. The scholars say legally it is primarily a contract, but it has clear devotional elements, which is why, for example, according to the majority of Islamic scholarship, getting married has greater reward than engaging in nafil acts of worship. So Jack and Jill went up the hill, they fell in love. But now Jack thinks about it, that I could just, I own this hut on top of the hill for the next 2 years. And he's running his own business, he's got money. I could either stay in this hut, there's good internet on top of the hill, so I could engage in devotion and seeking knowledge, or I could come down the hill and marry Jill. Which has greater reward? So there's difference of opinion. According to Imam Shafi'i, if you don't fear the haram or temptation in itself, if you are actually going to dedicate yourself to devotion and knowledge, you'd have greater reward. But Imam Abu Hanifa and the majority of Islamic scholars have said no. And also, even if that were theoretically true, but practically most people won't do it. Jack stays in his hut, he's just going to surf the internet. He's not going to seek knowledge, and he's not going to engage in devotion. That's what most people do, right? So that is, so the civil marriage is not in itself a nikah. It's not in itself a nikah. Unless the elements of the nikah, that there's a clear offer and a clear acceptance, and there are witnesses who know that there's a marriage taking place. But if you see how a civil marriage takes place, there isn't an ijab and qabul, etc. And we don't recognize non-Muslims' authority over Muslims in religious affairs. Right? And in that, we should not behave like doormats. Right? We have a right to practice our religion. Right? We'll try to practice it where we are. If you stop us and we are not able to seek our rights, then we migrate. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks, أَلَمْ تَكُنْ أَرْضُ اللَّهِ وَاسِعَةً. Was Allah's earth not vast enough? So you migrate somewhere where you can practice your deen. Where to practice the core of your deen. Because that is the reality of you. Every other identity besides you being a servant of Allah is just a contingent identity that you're not bound by in any absolute term. You're not bound by the fact that you're Punjabi or Hyderabadi or Damascus or Jordanian or Ethiopian or Eritrean. It's a contingent identity. Right? It's part of who you are, but that's not your reality. So there are messy situations where someone only got that. So a couple, Jack and Jill, didn't know anything about deen, so they just got a civil marriage. Then as soon as you discover, get a nikah done. Get a nikah done. Right? And in some situations we see, could it be validated? Yeah, their parents were there at the civil ceremony, etc. It's okay. So would there be enough elements? But that would be a fatwa situation. Those are very sensitive elements. One goes to someone who knows who knows the fiqh. Because sometimes they're sensitive situations. Okay. Any last questions before we close? Okay. So the summary is pretty straightforward, right? Please approach marriage with clarity and agreement. Have a proper marriage contract. Spend some time on making sure it's done in a proper way. Don't just sign off on some random paper. But also, before you enter a marriage, know what you're getting yourself into. If you travel and you're a sensible traveler, you'd spend some time choosing the right hotel for your 2-week trip. Right? You read some reviews. Even for a 4-day trip, you'll probably check the reviews, correct? Okay? But this is like, inshallah, for a lifetime. I'd say, well, let's see what happens. That's not being a good rational being. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us reason and revelation, reason and the nobility to act on our religious teachings. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barak ala Sayyidina wa Nabina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Just in closing, of course, in all of this, one of the important things in approaching marriage, that what do you want to come to an agreement to? It is important also to bring light into our choices by looking at the example of the prophetic marriage. There's nothing more beautiful than the prophetic marriage. It's actually a manifestation of the prophetic perfection. The Prophet ﷺ said in the hadith that's in Tirmidhi and Abu Dawood and elsewhere, it's a Sahih hadith, أكمل المؤمنين إيمانا أحسنهم خلقا. The believers most perfect in faith, most complete in faith, are those who are best in character. وَخِيَارُكُمْ خِيَارُكُمْ لِأَهْلِهِ. And the most virtuous of you are those most virtuous to their spouses. And then he said, وَأَنَا خِيَارُكُمْ لِأَهْلِهِ. And I am the most virtuous of you to his spouses, or more broadly to his family. So that's not just a factoid that, oh, he was the best of all people to his family, but also that if, that a key to good marriage is to strive to uphold good character. That's a test of your faith, because upholding good character when tested is a test of faith, but also that model of light that we want to uphold is the example of the Prophet ﷺ. So you could do yourself a favor by spending some time if you're approaching marriage, to look at the Prophet's marriage with Sayyidah Khadija, the Prophet's marriage with Sayyidah Aisha, and the other marriages of the Prophet ﷺ. And we've looked in previous seminars at examples of the marriages of the righteous, the marriages of the past prophets, and of the Prophet ﷺ, and of the prophetic household and the righteous. Last thing, of course, if you are in a tough situation, some of the righteous actually would choose to marry the worst person possible. Why? Because if marriage is a test of good character, then if you marry someone who is testing of your good character, then this is a great opportunity. Why? Because if you can uphold good character when tested, this is min kamal al-iman, or min ikmal al-iman. It's from the perfection and perfecting of faith. So much so that some of the righteous will actually choose, say, if you want to perfect your faith, to perfect your heart and soul, marry the worst person possible. And one, so you can have sabr, right? Number two, to perfect your good character, to cultivate your faith, to draw closer to Allah. But they also intend to protect the Muslims from this person's harm. Okay? So Jack marries Jill, and he doesn't want other people to be hurt by her sharp tongue and her annoyance. Okay? So they would intend so that no one else of the Muslims would be harmed. They would bear the harm themselves. But may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us spouses instead who are a means by which to uphold love and mercy and all good. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina wa Nabina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. And I apologize, a lot of this is a bit heavy and dreary, but it's important because of its consequences.